Reverse sincerity loop. There's a psychological tactic so disorienting, so quietly powerful, that most people don't realize it's happening until they're already unraveling from within. It doesn't rely on threats. It doesn't scream or accuse. In fact, it does the opposite. It tells you that you're right. It nods along. It agrees. It praises your version of events, even if that version is false. And that's where the trap begins. This is the reverse sincerity loop. Imagine this. You make a small lie, harmless, maybe to avoid confrontation, maybe to protect someone. You say, "I wasn't there that night." And the person across from you, instead of questioning, instead of doubting, leans forward with soft eyes and says, "Of course you weren't. I wouldn't expect anything less from you. You've always been so trustworthy. People don't see how loyal you really are." Suddenly something shifts. Your heart beats faster. Your mind tries to recalibrate. The lie wasn't meant to be believed so fully. Now it feels exposed because they believed it too easily, too earnestly. The validation doesn't comfort you, it unsettles you. Why? Because now you start to wonder what they know. The reverse sincerity loop works not by attacking your integrity, but by inflating it, so much so that the pressure to maintain the illusion becomes unbearable. The very act of being believed becomes a psychological weapon. And the more convincingly the lie is affirmed, the more dissonance builds inside the liar. Not because they fear being caught, but because they fear the distortion of their own identity. A small lie requires a small performance. But when someone else takes your lie and spins it into a flattering truth, when they trust you more than you trust yourself, it forces a reaction, often a confession. Not because of guilt alone, but because of a desire to reclaim authorship over reality. You weren't expecting to be believed, and now that you are, you need to confess, not to clear your conscience, but to reestablish control. This tactic has been used in interrogations, relationships, cult indoctrinations, even politics. It is slow and quiet, but devastatingly effective. In one infamous psychological study, participants were asked to complete a basic task and later falsely accused of pressing a forbidden button. Some resisted. But when the experimenter praised them, "I know someone like you wouldn't press it. You're too careful, too precise." Many cracked. Not because they were being accused, but because the praise felt like a trap, and they began to admit things. "Well, maybe I leaned on it by accident. I'm not sure anymore. Maybe I did press it." Notice the shift. They began with denial, but when the denial was affirmed, sincerity itself became suspicious. This is the reverse loop. Praise that destabilizes, agreement that unnerves. In toxic relationships, this often appears when someone is trying to test your loyalty. Let's say you go out late, come home, and fabricate a simple explanation. Your partner responds, "I believe you, I always do. You've never lied to me, and you never would." That's what makes us strong. You feel seen, then you feel sick. Because in that moment, they've handed you a version of yourself that you know isn't true. And now, you have a choice. Reinforce the image, or shatter it. Most people choose to shatter it, not out of moral virtue, but because it restores equilibrium. It gives them back the ability to shape their own story. What makes the reverse sincerity loop so powerful is that it weaponizes the discomfort of being misrepresented, even when the representation is positive, especially when it's positive. It's hard to be seen as a villain, but sometimes it's harder to be seen as a saint when you know you're not one. Skilled manipulators use this, not by accusing you, but by glorifying you. "You'd never hurt me. You're too honest for that. I trust you more than anyone." These aren't compliments, they're control mechanisms, because now you are the one who feels the tension. You are the one who has to decide whether to live inside the illusion or break it. And most people break it. They start to explain, then to justify, then to tell the truth. Not because they were confronted, but because the praise felt off, like a mirror reflecting someone else's face. It's even more dangerous in institutions, corporations, governments, religions. Leaders sometimes reverse the loop to root out dissent. Instead of punishing betrayal, they praise loyalty so intensely that it becomes suffocating. A member might say, "I've been struggling with doubt." The leader responds, "I understand, but I know your heart. You've always been our strongest believer. Even when things are hard, you stay true." Now the member panics, because their internal doubts don't match the role they've just been cast in. And the only way to regain internal coherence is to confess, to admit, to break down. This is not an interrogation, it's a loop, a subtle dance of reality distortion. It flips the sincerity equation. Instead of doubting the liar, you praise the lie, and watch the liar come undone, because now they're the only one who knows it's false. There's a concept in philosophy called epistemic pressure, the discomfort we feel when we hold knowledge that others do not. In the reverse sincerity loop, this pressure is dialed up to unbearable levels. You're no longer hiding a lie. You're hiding from a world that sees you as something you're not. The urge to confess isn't about truth. It's about escape. Escape from the role you never meant to play. That's the secret of the reverse sincerity loop. It's not a confrontation. It's a mirror held too kindly. And the more gently it's held, the more violently we react to it, because it reflects a self we can't live with. So, the next time someone believes you too easily, pause. Ask yourself, are they trusting you, or are they setting the stage for you to reveal something you didn't even know you needed to say? Because sometimes silence isn't the trap. Belief is. Cold empathy. Frame, imagine yourself seated beside someone at a long wooden table. A fire burns gently in the hearth. Their voice trembles as they speak, a confession of something unresolved. You nod slowly. You do not interject. You do not reassure. You simply reflect back the shape of their feeling without absorbing its heat. And in this quiet, something unusual happens. They keep speaking. They begin to reveal more than they intended. They fill the silence you've left with fragments of truth they hadn't planned to give. You've done nothing but sit with their feeling without diving into it yourself. This is not cruelty. It is not warmth either. It is something in between. A strategy as old as the first campfire conversations. Known today in some circles as the cold empathy frame. In modern terms, this refers to mirroring another person's emotions, acknowledging them, even appearing to understand them, but without reacting. No judgment, no dramatic facial shift, just calm reflection, a slight nod, a soft, "I see." The effect is disarming. In removing emotional feedback, the speaker finds themselves more exposed, not less. And yet, it's hardly a new technique. In the 16th century, a letter survives from an English nobleman writing to his steward about a tenant dispute. The tenant, having lost livestock in a storm, had come to plead his case, tears in his eyes, voice cracking. The steward, the nobleman noted, had responded with a steady face and no undue commiseration, and by such, the fellow spoke fuller than was needful. The result? The man revealed that the animals hadn't died in the storm at all. He had sold them for drink. Cold empathy. Centuries before psychology gave it a name, this frame does not provoke or soothe, it reflects. Much like water reflects a face but gives back no warmth. The speaker, lacking reaction, is drawn into a kind of self-dialogue. They try to find the missing piece in your stillness. They speak to fill the void. And in doing so, they often say more than they meant to. In ancient Rome, this dynamic played out in formal legal settings. Advocates trained not only in rhetoric, but in posture, how to sit, how to listen. A successful orator often spoke less than his opponent, using long pauses and calm, attentive silence to draw out contradictions. The philosopher Seneca once wrote that, "The most honest things are said to those who do not rush to forgive." Imagine a quiet stone room, lit by oil lamp. Two figures sit across from one another. One confesses, the other listens. There is no interruption, no gasping sympathy, no stern rebuke, just stillness. Eventually, the speaker begins to revise themselves, clarify, confess again, this time in greater detail. Not under pressure, but in response to the vacuum of reaction. In medieval Japan, certain monks acted as informal confessors, not because they offered absolution, but because they listened without response. Travelers who had committed wrongs or carried grief would speak to them, not to receive guidance, but because in the monk's quiet gaze there was space to unravel. These monks were often referred to as mirrors of the self, reflecting a person's emotional state back at them with neither embrace nor condemnation. This effect, the cold empathy frame, works not because it is manipulative, but because it triggers a deep discomfort with emotional imbalance. Humans expect emotional symmetry. Joy meets joy. Sadness draws comfort. Anger receives pushback. But when emotion is met with calm understanding and no response, the rhythm is broken. The speaker becomes uncertain. That uncertainty opens doors. In many households across Europe during the Enlightenment period, familial arguments were not won with shouting, but with quiet reflection. Diaries from French salons record how certain matriarchs could diffuse volatile topics simply by listening so attentively, so blankly, that the speaker began second-guessing themselves. "She made me feel like I was speaking into a glass," one guest wrote. "I could see myself, but not her. And so, I corrected myself." It's not always used kindly. In negotiation, in interrogation, in the subtle politics of court life, cold empathy could be a weapon. The court of Louis XIV was full of such performances. Letters describe how the king's silence during petitioners' speeches would cause them to tremble, not knowing if their words pleased or condemned. Often they would add further explanation, exposing their own ambitions or falsehoods, in a desperate bid to fill the blankness he offered them. But it is also, in some ways, a gift. Not everyone wants to be comforted. Some want to be seen, not fixed, not agreed with, just witnessed. Today, the cold empathy frame lives on in quiet therapists, seasoned diplomats, and even in family members who say little but somehow hear everything. It thrives in rooms where emotional honesty struggles against politeness. It's not dramatic. It is not loud. It is not even warm. But it is present and powerful. Imagine once more a long pause between words, the fire still crackling softly in the hearth. Across from you, someone waits for your response. You offer no judgment, no relief, just a nod, just stillness. They inhale, and then they continue. Not because you pulled something from them, but because your silence made room for it. And in that space, people reveal more than they ever do under pressure. Not from fear, but from the strange comfort of a mirror that listens, without speaking back. Invisible obligation trap. You're standing in line. A stranger behind you taps your shoulder and smiles, then offers to hold your coffee while you adjust your bag. You thank them politely. It's small, nothing special, a kind gesture in an ordinary moment. 10 minutes later, they ask if you could let them go ahead. They're late. Without thinking, you nod. Of course, it feels like the right thing to do. But something happened there. A transaction. Unspoken, invisible. One favor, one small act of goodwill. Followed by a request. You felt obligated, but you didn't agree to anything. You weren't tricked or coerced. So why did you say yes? This is the invisible obligation trap. A form of psychological conditioning that doesn't look like control because it feels like kindness. It builds slowly, favor by favor, until the weight of someone's generosity becomes a leash you didn't notice being tied. Here's how it works. The human brain keeps score, not consciously, not like a ledger, but deep down, we track reciprocity. When someone gives to us time, energy, attention, we feel pressure to give something back. It's ancient, tribal, a survival reflex. Those who give keep the group alive, and those who don't return the favor, they're seen as threats, as freeloaders, as dangers to cohesion. So we overcorrect. Someone does a favor for us, and we feel a pang, a social debt, even if we never asked for it, especially if we never asked for it. And that's what makes this trap so powerful. The best manipulators don't ask for anything at first. They give. Quietly, repeatedly, thoughtfully, until you start to feel like you owe them something. And when they finally do ask, something small or something big, it doesn't feel like manipulation. It feels like fairness. Picture a workplace. A colleague brings you coffee one morning. You didn't ask. You're surprised, grateful. They laugh it off. No big deal. A week later, they offer to help with a presentation. Then they let you borrow their charger. They compliment your work in meetings. Each gesture adds up. And then one day, they need something. Help finishing a report. A favor with the manager. A personal secret kept quiet. You hesitate. But some part of you whispers, you owe them. This isn't just about favors. It's about shaping perception. Every act of unrequested kindness becomes a psychological hook, a thread tied between you and them. And the more threads they tie, the more tangled your sense of independence becomes. There's a reason cults use this tactic. Not dramatic rituals or overt threats, but small kindnesses. meals offered, attention given, smiles, hugs, inclusion. You're welcomed with warmth, told you matter. You didn't ask for love, but you got it. And now leaving feels cruel, ungrateful, even dangerous. The same tactic shows up in toxic relationships. A partner showers you with affection early on, buys gifts, compliments you constantly, makes sacrifices, offers help, and you start to feel chosen, special. But that gift becomes a chain. Later, when they demand control or grow resentful or manipulate your choices, you hesitate to resist. After all, they've done so much for you. How can you question their intent? This is not kindness. It's calculated imbalance. The trap lies not in the giving, but in the silent accounting it installs in your mind. You feel watched, not overtly, but internally. Your decisions pass through the filter of guilt and debt, and soon your choices aren't yours anymore. Some governments use this tactic, not with violence, but subsidies, aid, and favors. Entire populations come to rely on the benevolence of the authority. And once dependency sets in, once enough people feel they owe their survival to the system, loyalty isn't requested. It's extracted through quiet obligation. Even in friendships, the invisible obligation trap can appear. Someone always pays the bill, always listens to your problems, always helps you move, solve, comfort, support. It feels generous, but it comes with invisible strings. The day you say no to them, they look wounded. After all I've done for you, that phrase is the heartbeat of the trap. After all I've done. What makes this tactic so dangerous is that it hijacks our conscience. It doesn't force you. It convinces you to chain yourself. And the worst part? It can happen without malice. Some people don't even realize they're doing it. They give compulsively, then resent when others don't repay. But even if it's unconscious, the result is the same. You begin to lose your ability to say no without guilt. So, how do you break free? Start by noticing the difference between a gift and a contract. A real gift expects nothing in return. But if every act of kindness is followed by a reminder, a tally, a favor owed, then you're not in a relationship. You're in a silent negotiation you never signed up for. Listen to the language. Do they bring up the past every time they want something? Do they phrase requests as emotional debts? I was there for you, so, or I always help you, why won't you? These are not appeals to fairness. They are pressure valves, slowly bleeding your agency. And finally, give yourself permission to reject the weight of unspoken obligation. You don't owe someone your peace just because they gave you a ride. You don't owe someone your silence just because they once comforted you. Gratitude should not be currency. Kindness is not a contract. The invisible obligation trap is powerful because it wears the mask of goodwill. It feels warm, safe, affirming, but underneath it's a quiet erosion, not of your freedom, but of your clarity. It muddies the waters of choice with guilt and social currency until you forget that you have the right to choose. So, next time someone does you a favor, pause, accept it, appreciate it, but ask yourself, does this come freely or does it come with a silent ledger that only they can read? And the next time you feel pressured to give, to agree, to say yes, pause again. Ask, are you acting from your own will or from a debt you never agreed to carry? Because the real danger isn't that someone is trying to control you. The real danger is that they already have, by convincing you that you owe them something more than your own freedom. Predictive compliment seed. You've probably received a compliment that made you feel seen, acknowledged not for who you are, but for who you might become. Maybe someone once said, "You've always had a natural leadership aura, even when you'd never led anything." Or told you, "You seem like the kind of person who will write a book someday, even though you'd never written a page." And weeks, months, maybe even years later, you did lead. You did write. Not because you were forced, but because some part of you began to believe that version of yourself. That's the power of the predictive compliment seed. It sounds harmless, even kind, but at its core, it's a strategic psychological maneuver, a subtle shaping tool that operates below awareness. It isn't a compliment for what someone has done. It's a compliment for what they haven't done yet. A planted identity that grows silently, curling itself into their choices, behaviors, and self-concept until the prophecy fulfills itself. And they never realize the gardener was you. This technique works because the human mind has a powerful drive for internal consistency. When someone we trust, admire, or even fear gives us a label, especially a positive one, we feel pressure to live up to it, not externally, internally. We begin to recalibrate our decisions to match this prediction, often without knowing it. You say to a colleague, "You've got this calm, strategic mind. You're going to be a great negotiator someday." That seed lodges in their self-perception. The next time they're in a heated meeting, they remember that compliment. Not consciously, but subtly. They pause, speak slower, reframe their tone, and in doing so, they become exactly what you predicted. Not because you forced them, because you suggested it, gently, persuasively, as if it was already true. The brilliance of the predictive compliment seed is that it bypasses resistance. It flatters the ego while giving it a map. Most people resist direct orders or blunt advice, but few resist a sincere-sounding compliment, especially one that imagines them as smarter, stronger, wiser, more creative, more courageous than they currently are. We want to believe in our higher potential, so when someone tells us it's visible already, we act like it is, even if it wasn't before. Now here's where it becomes intense. You can use this tactic to shape someone's identity over time. Imagine telling a young sibling, "You've always had this quiet resilience. Even when things get tough, I see it in you." They haven't faced anything hard yet, but now, when life hits them, they won't crumble. They'll reach for that compliment. Not out of pride, but out of a buried conviction that they're supposed to survive, that someone already saw them do it. This isn't just manipulation. It's influence at the identity level, not behavior, not motivation, but who they think they are. And the most dangerous part, it works in reverse too. Because the same principle drives negative predictive compliments, what some call toxic expectations. Telling a child, "You're such a heartbreaker. I can already tell you're going to be trouble someday." It sounds playful, but you've just planted a future self-image, and later, when that child behaves recklessly, cheats, lies, or seduces, they're not surprised, because you told them they would. Humans are story-driven. We long for coherence between what others say we are and what we experience internally. If those stories are written by others, we live them, sometimes at the cost of what we might have truly become. In group settings, predictive compliment seeding becomes even more powerful. A leader can shift a whole culture by speaking aspirationally, not just about what is, but what will be. Telling a rising team member, "You've got the instincts of a future VP," makes them work like one. Telling a student, "You think like a researcher," makes them dig deeper, connect data differently. People follow the shape of the compliment like a blueprint they didn't know they were holding, but the truly skilled don't seed just once. They layer it, repeat it, echo it across time until it becomes embedded, and they tailor it precisely. Too much praise, and it feels fake. Too vague, and it evaporates. But the right compliment, specific, believable, slightly aspirational, lands like truth. "You always look at problems from such a wide-angle lens. That's rare." Or, "You've got a weirdly poetic mind. I hope you keep writing." Or, "You've got a quiet kind of authority that makes people listen." And just like that, you've rewired their internal narrative. This is not a parlor trick. It's not a social media tactic. It's the foundation of how mentors shape protégés, how cult leaders bind followers, how parents build or damage children. It's how you can reach into someone's psychological soil and bury a thought so deep they grow into it without ever questioning where it came from. Used with care, this is powerful. A compliment like, "You're the kind of person who remembers the little things," can turn someone thoughtful. Saying, "You strike me as someone who forgives deeply," can soften bitterness before it ever takes hold. It's identity reinforcement, disguised as encouragement. But used with intent, it becomes something darker. Telling someone, "You always sacrifice for others," even if untrue, can mold them into someone who gives until it hurts. Telling a friend, "You always take the high road," can pressure them into silence when they should speak. The seed doesn't know morality. It only knows growth. You choose the fruit it bears. So, what do you do with this? If you want to shape others, ethically, powerfully, don't just tell them what they are. Tell them what they could be, with calm certainty, as if the future is already written and they're just catching up to your vision. The mind will try to fulfill the prophecy you whispered, because we are all becoming what someone once said we were destined to be. And if no one says it, if no one gives us that seed, we may never become it at all. So the next time you open your mouth to compliment someone, pause. Think. What are you planting? Because once it's in the soil, it grows, and they'll call it their own. Echo reframing spiral. Imagine someone tells you, "I just feel like no one listens to me anymore." Now, instead of offering sympathy or advice, you quietly repeat back, "So what I'm hearing is, it feels like people don't really hear what matters to you." But you add a small twist, one that pivots the meaning slightly, subtly nudging their own thought just a step forward. That is the beginning of the echo reframing spiral, a conversational technique so subtle, so surgical, that the person speaking often doesn't realize they're being led until their perspective has already shifted. This isn't about manipulation in the obvious sense. It's not coercion, it's not deceit, it's resonance, but engineered. Because when people feel heard, they open up. And when you echo their language back with slight, intentional alterations, you create the illusion of deep understanding, while in truth, you're steering the emotional current. It's like walking next to someone and gently guiding their shoulder, not enough for them to notice the pressure, but enough to change their direction without them ever questioning it. At its core, this spiral begins with mirroring, not the crude mimicry of parroting, but the emotionally intelligent kind. Mirroring tone, energy, and the rhythm of their speech. When someone says, "I'm just not sure if I'm good enough," the echo isn't, "You're not sure if you're good enough." The echo becomes, "So you're in a place where you're really questioning your own worth, maybe even your value." That shift from good enough to worth or value deepens the frame. It signals not only that you heard them, but that you heard beneath them. This subtle tweak causes a micro-jolt in the speaker's mind. They hear their own pain reflected back, but suddenly it's more profound, more real. And because it came from your mouth, it sounds objective, credible, as if you understand their experience better than they do. And in that moment, they begin to trust your version of their reality. That's the spiral. You repeat, you tweak, you deepen. Then repeat again, adjusting the frame each time. It's slow, gentle. But by the third or fourth turn, they're agreeing with things they didn't initially believe. They're nodding to insights that, just minutes ago, would have felt alien. You haven't changed their mind with logic. You've reframed their inner narrative using their own vocabulary, just rearranged like puzzle pieces to fit your picture. Let's ground this in a real-world example. Imagine a coworker says, "I don't know if I should speak up in meetings. I just feel like I'll sound dumb." Instead of challenging that insecurity with a typical encouragement like, "Don't be silly, your ideas are great," the echo reframing spiral says, "So there's a fear there, that maybe your voice won't be taken seriously, or worse, that it'll be misunderstood." Notice how the focus has shifted from sounding dumb to being misunderstood. That one tweak upgrades the emotional weight of the statement. And more importantly, it places the burden not on the speaker, but on the listener. Suddenly it's not you who's inadequate. It's the environment that might fail to interpret you. This tiny pivot gives the speaker something they weren't asking for, but desperately needed: dignity. Then you go one step further. You follow that reframing with, "And yet, I can tell that you care a lot about clarity and that you've probably thought your ideas through more than you give yourself credit for." Now the spiral is spinning. The original self-doubt has transformed into a quiet acknowledgement of thoughtfulness. You've created the illusion that their insecurity is actually a sign of emotional intelligence. And because it's built from their original statement, they don't resist it. In fact, they embrace it. This spiral works exceptionally well with emotionally charged topics: grief, identity, shame, doubt. Say someone confesses, "I feel like I'm never going to move on from this breakup." You don't respond with a lecture on healing or time. You say, "So right now, it feels like the absence has completely consumed your sense of who you were with them." You've just echoed their pain, but with a layer of existential framing. Suddenly the issue isn't just heartbreak, it's the collapse of a shared identity. And when they nod, overwhelmed by the accuracy of your reflection, you say, "That kind of emptiness only happens when someone gave a piece of themselves to something that mattered." Again, the spiral lifts their pain into a dignified frame. They don't feel judged, they feel seen. What makes this tactic both powerful and dangerous is that the speaker rarely realizes what's happening. The tweaks are too small, the shifts are too emotionally resonant, and each time they hear their thoughts reflected back with new weight, they're more willing to trust your next version of the truth. That's why cult leaders, therapists, negotiators, and skilled manipulators all use variations of this spiral. It's empathy on the surface, influence at its core. There's a neurological reason this works. When we hear our own words reflected back with intensity and nuance, it lights up the brain's mirror neuron system. This is the part responsible for empathy, recognition, and emotional bonding. It responds as if someone is finishing our emotional sentences. That creates rapport, not from shared experience, but from shared language. The person feels as though you're on their wavelength, but you're not. You're leading the frequency. The ethical line here is razor thin. When used with care, the echo reframing spiral can be a bridge toward healing, a way to help someone make sense of their own chaos. But in the wrong hands, it becomes a trap. Because when someone is desperate to be understood, they'll follow any voice that makes them feel heard, even if that voice is rearranging their beliefs in real time. And here's the haunting part. The more emotionally vulnerable a person is, the more susceptible they become to this spiral. They don't just absorb the reframes, they need them, especially in moments of loss, confusion, or transition. That's when people crave clarity, even if that clarity is built from illusions. If you've ever walked away from a conversation feeling like someone just got you, take a second look. Were your words repeated back in slightly different terms? Did the person seem to understand things you hadn't fully said? Did they deepen your thoughts in ways that felt revelatory? If so, there's a chance you weren't just heard. You were reframed. The echo reframing spiral isn't about talking someone into something. It's about guiding them down a staircase of their own thoughts, only slightly rearranged. Each step feels familiar, but the landing place is somewhere they never meant to go. They arrive at a new conclusion, but because it felt like their idea the whole way down, they never question it. And in the quiet moments after that conversation ends, they may sit alone with a sense of peace or clarity that feels earned, but that peace didn't come from within. It came from you, from your echoes, from your edits, from the spiral. If that realization feels unsettling, it should, because every conversation holds within it the potential not just to connect, but to reshape. And those who know how to echo well don't need to argue. They only need to listen, just enough to repeat, then just enough to reframe, and then just enough to spiral the mind toward wherever they want it to go. This is not just persuasion, it's emotional architecture, and you are either the builder or the blueprint. Timed silence pressure. It begins with a question, a simple one, maybe even innocent, but then silence. No follow-up, no nod, no smile, just stillness. And that stillness starts to grow. At first, it feels like space. Then it becomes pressure, a pause that stretches longer than it should. You begin to wonder if something's wrong, if they didn't believe you, if your answer didn't land. You rush to fill it. This is the timed silence pressure, a tactic so subtle, so uncomfortable, that most people break under it without even knowing why. In a world addicted to noise and response, silence becomes a scalpel. It slices through social conventions, it strips away rehearsed answers, and it forces the mind to squirm in its own uncertainty. Here's how it works. A person asks a question. Where were you last night? You respond, just out with some friends. And then they say nothing. No reaction. No raised eyebrows. No dismissive shrug. Just eye contact and silence. At first, your brain tries to rationalize. Maybe they didn't hear you. Maybe they're thinking. But second by second, the silence doesn't comfort. It sharpens. Because we're wired for response, conversation is a rhythm. You speak, I speak. We pass the baton of attention, but when that handoff doesn't come, something short circuits. You start to question your own answer. Was it too vague? Did it sound rehearsed? Was there something in your tone? That's when the trap closes. In that pressure, people begin to speak again, filling the air with clarifications, justifications, sometimes even confessions. Not because they're guilty, but because silence feels like accusation. And the only way to escape that silence is to explain. This tactic is used in high-stakes negotiations, police interrogations, intelligence work, but it also appears in everyday life, relationships, job interviews, even parental discipline. A mother asks her child, "Did you take the money from my purse?" The child says, "No," and then silence. She just looks, and the seconds stretch. 5, 10, 15. The child starts again. Well, I saw it there, but I didn't touch it. And now the story changes, not because of force, but because of nothing. Silence becomes the interrogator. It works because the human brain is deeply uncomfortable with unresolved tension. We crave resolution. When someone doesn't respond, we interpret it as a sign that we need to say more. In truth, timed silence isn't neutral. It's loaded. It says, I'm not convinced. I'm watching. There's more you're not telling me. But none of that has to be spoken. The silence says it all. In psychological terms, this taps into something called negative space discomfort. When a conversation lacks closure, the cognitive load increases. We feel off balance, uncertain, exposed. So we reach for certainty by offering more. Ironically, the person using silence isn't doing anything. They're just waiting. But that very waiting becomes an act of power. It flips the dynamic. The speaker is now on trial, and the judge refuses to speak. This tactic is especially dangerous in manipulative relationships. One partner might use prolonged silence after being asked a question or hearing a confession. They don't yell. They don't argue. They just withhold reaction. And in that vacuum, the other person begins to spiral. They apologize more than they need to. They dig into explanations no one asked for. They offer vulnerabilities just to end the quiet, because nothing feels louder than someone who chooses not to speak. Even in interviews, skilled recruiters use this technique. You answer a question, and they just pause. No smile, no validation. Just quiet. Suddenly you feel the need to keep talking. You mention a weakness you hadn't planned to share. You backtrack on a confident statement. You dilute your own power, just to break the silence. And they never had to ask a second question. The beauty and the danger of timed silence is that it plays entirely within social rules. It's not overtly aggressive. It doesn't break norms. It uses norms against you. Because in normal conversation, silence after an answer means disapproval, so we scramble to earn approval again. But here's the truth. Silence doesn't always mean disapproval. Sometimes it's strategy. And once you realize that, you can start to hold your ground. Because the real mastery is not in breaking others with silence, but in learning not to be broken by it. When someone asks you a question and then falls quiet, what if you stayed quiet too? What if you sat in the tension without folding? That's when silence becomes yours. That's when power flips. Because silence is a tool. In the right hands, it's a weapon. But in your hands, it can be armor. The next time someone asks a hard question and then just looks at you, remember this. You don't owe the silence anything. Let it stretch. Let it ache. But do not fill it with more truth than you intended to share. Because sometimes, the only thing that needs to be said is nothing at all. Emotional decoy. Layering. Imagine a candlelit room in an old stone house. You've just met someone, perhaps at supper, perhaps during a long journey. You speak to pass the time. As the fire crackles, you share something small, something honest, but not heavy. Maybe it's a childhood mistake, a fear of horses, a habit you've never quite broken. The other person nods, smiles, laughs softly. Then, almost reflexively, they offer something in return, a deeper memory, a closer truth. But what you didn't say, what you never planned to say, is still beneath the surface. And by the time the conversation arrives there, it no longer feels like a revelation. It feels like a continuation. This is emotional decoy layering. It begins with something that appears raw, but is carefully chosen. The trick is not deception. It's pacing. The layering of truth. Not all at once, but gently, gradually. You begin with a small window, a glimpse, one detail that signals vulnerability, and in response, others lower their guard. Not because they are forced to, but because reciprocity is built into the rhythm of conversation. The practice is not modern. In fact, it may be one of the oldest social strategies humans have used. In the court circles of Renaissance Italy, letters often described how noble women and advisors would begin conversations with what appeared to be personal confessions about a failed poem, an unreturned letter, a youthful embarrassment, seemingly trivial but revealing. In the same breath, they would then steer conversations toward more sensitive matters, debts, alliances, betrayals. And because the first detail had already softened the space, the rest came easier. The structure of these conversations was deliberate. The first story made the listener feel trusted. The second made them curious. The third made them reciprocate. By the time the real motive emerged, it no longer felt manipulative. It felt natural. This, in essence, is the emotional decoy. In some households during the Victorian era, this pattern became almost ritualistic, especially between generations. A parent might start by mentioning how they once skipped lessons as a child, how they too feared disappointment. Then, slowly, they'd ask about the child's own fears. They wouldn't begin with interrogation. They'd begin with softness. A rehearsed softness, perhaps, but effective nonetheless. Imagine a worn journal tucked into a drawer in 1843. A father writes to his daughter who has stopped answering letters. He begins with a story about the winter he once broke through the ice while skating, and the fear he felt in the silence afterward. A harmless memory, but it is not the point. The next paragraph asks, gently, whether she is truly happy where she is, whether she's safe, whether she is, perhaps, lonely. The emotional decoy was the story of the ice. It gave permission. It built a bridge. In human behavior, trust rarely begins at the center. It spirals inward. The outer layers must be peeled slowly, too quickly, and the other person pulls back. Too slowly, and they never arrive. But when paced with care, the disclosures become mutual, rhythmic. One small truth leads to another. One glimpse leads to something more difficult to say. And eventually, the core is reached, not with force, but with gravity. In certain psychological studies from the 20th century, researchers noted that participants who were asked to share personal but non-critical stories first, like a strange habit or a silly childhood belief, were more likely to open up about deeper matters later. The sequencing mattered. Vulnerability couldn't be demanded, but it could be coaxed by offering a decoy, an honest one, but one that wasn't the real target. This also appears in folklore. In Eastern European storytelling traditions, there are tales where a stranger approaches a guarded village. They do not ask to enter directly. They ask first for water, then for shade, then, perhaps, for a moment by the fire, each request small, each one opening the way for the next. The final ask, a night's stay, or a question of deep importance, comes last. But it's no longer startling. The listener has already crossed thresholds with them. Imagine sitting across from someone you wish to know better. You don't begin by asking what burdens they carry. You begin by offering a small one of your own. It is not false. It is not irrelevant. But it is chosen. A decoy, but an emotional one. And the other person, not wanting to leave your offering unanswered, gives you something in return. Maybe more than they meant to. Maybe more than they've said aloud before. And suddenly the conversation has arrived somewhere neither of you planned. But both of you recognize, this is not always manipulation. Sometimes it is kindness. A way of showing someone that it's safe to speak, by speaking first. But it is also a strategy. One used in diplomacy, in counseling, in espionage, in everyday friendships and marriages. A way of moving closer without appearing to. You begin with the outer layer, something soft. You peel it back slowly. Each word leads gently to the next. And by the time the real question is asked, it no longer feels like a question at all. It feels like a door that was already half open. Contextual memory. Hijack. It always starts small. A quiet moment in the middle of chaos. A hand on your shoulder when you're breaking down. A voice that cuts through panic like a thread of calm. You don't remember the words, not really. You just remember that when everything was spinning, they were there. And suddenly, it didn't feel so impossible. You didn't plan to attach your sense of safety to them. It just happened. That is the essence of the contextual memory hijack. A form of emotional conditioning so subtle, so deeply embedded in the wiring of human memory, that you mistake it for love, for loyalty, for instinct. But what it really is psychological anchoring. A hijack of your internal associations until one person becomes your nervous system's shortcut to relief. Here's how it works. Your brain doesn't record events as isolated facts. It stores them as contexts, a feeling, a smell, a sensation. When you're scared, every detail around you becomes stamped with urgency. Where you were, who was there, what they said. And whoever stands by you in that moment becomes fused into the memory, not as an observer, but as part of the solution. They don't need to do much, just show up. Just be the calm in the storm. And suddenly, your limbic system begins to code them as safety. Over time, your brain doesn't just remember them during chaos, it craves them. This is powerful. It's the reason people bond with therapists, even when no personal relationship exists. It's why hostages sometimes feel affection for captors, who show rare moments of kindness amidst terror. It's why, even after a toxic relationship ends, you might still feel a surge of calm when you hear their voice, because they were there when you broke, and your mind filed them under relief. The manipulation comes when this is done on purpose. Skilled emotional manipulators, charismatic leaders, controlling partners, even cult recruiters, engineer situations where they become the only source of calm in a whirlwind they often create. First, they isolate you. Maybe not physically, but emotionally. They wait for your moments of anxiety, or subtly stir the waters just enough to disorient you. Then, they soothe. They comfort. They offer clarity, just enough to be the oasis in your desert. You begin to associate them with peace, even when they are the ones causing the storm. In psychological terms, this is state-dependent conditioning. Just like Pavlov's dog salivated at the sound of a bell, your nervous system learns to calm itself at the presence of the hijacker, and you won't even know it's happening. Here's an example. You're new at a job, overwhelmed, uncertain, a coworker notices. They step in, not officially, not loudly, but they guide you through things, offer tips, talk you down from frustration. They become your anchor. Soon, every time you feel anxious, your instinct is to look for them, to hear their voice. And over time, your sense of competence and calm is entangled with their presence. It feels like friendship, but it's more like dependency. This happens in relationships too. During arguments, one partner may escalate things, then immediately become the only source of comfort. They hurt, then soothe, scold, then kiss. The nervous system doesn't track fairness, it tracks relief. And the person who causes the tension can also become the only person who resolves it. This is the hijack. In cults, the strategy is almost textbook. The leader warns of outside threats, spiritual, political, emotional. They stir fear. Then, in the next breath, they offer peace, a solution, a ritual, a smile. And slowly the brain begins to equate the leader's voice with safety. Not because they are safe, but because they control when fear ends. It's not just cults. Think of charismatic bosses, narcissistic parents, overbearing lovers. Every time you feel overwhelmed, they just happen to be there. Not by coincidence, but design. And eventually, without ever realizing it, you begin to seek them, not for love, not for joy, but for nervous system regulation. They have become a drug you never meant to take, a sedative wearing the mask of care. So, how do you recognize the hijack? Ask yourself, does this person always seem to appear in my lowest moments? Do I only feel peace through them, not around them? Do I feel nervous when they're gone? Not because something bad happened, but because I've lost access to the only tool that helps me feel calm? And most importantly, has my body confused dependency with affection? The body doesn't lie, but it does learn. If someone repeatedly shows up during your breakdowns, your subconscious will start to crave them during future ones, even if they're the ones who keep pushing you into those breakdowns to begin with. Freedom begins when you uncouple the memory, when you teach your nervous system that safety isn't something someone else gives you, it's something you can build without them. It's not easy. The rewiring takes time. It might feel empty at first. You might mistake the absence of the hijacker as the return of the storm, but that's just the echo of a trap falling silent. Start small. Notice what soothes you that has nothing to do with them. Music, breathing, movement. Anchor your safety to things that don't ask for loyalty in return. Create space between your peace and their presence, and in that space, you'll begin to remember who you were before comfort had a name. The contextual memory hijack is real. It's subtle, and it works because it bypasses logic. It speaks directly to your body, not your thoughts. That's why it's so hard to resist. And that's why it's so important to name it. Because if you don't name it, you will keep returning to the person who made you feel safe once, even if they have never made you feel free. Reflective guilt impila. It starts with a question. Not an accusation, not an insult, just a question. Are you sure that was the right thing to say? Not harsh, not hostile, just curious, reflective. And yet, something shifts. A ripple moves beneath the surface of their confidence. They pause, think back, rehearse what they said, replay how they acted, and doubt, once planted, begins to grow. This is the reflective guilt implant, a psychological maneuver that bypasses direct confrontation and instead turns someone's own self-reflection against them. It doesn't criticize, it doesn't argue, it simply asks, softly, strategically, until their self-assurance erodes under the weight of their own overthinking. It works because human beings are hardwired to reflect, to monitor, to seek approval and correction through internal feedback loops. When you pose a question that implies subtle wrongdoing, the target isn't pushed. They're invited to doubt themselves. And because the source of the guilt isn't external, they can't fight it. There's no blame to deny, only reflection. And once reflection begins, it doesn't easily stop. Ask a friend, do you think maybe you talked over her a little? The seed is planted. They replay the conversation in their mind. Every interruption feels sharper now, every pause more guilty. And suddenly, their version of events isn't trustworthy anymore, not because you proved them wrong, but because they can no longer prove themselves right. The most effective guilt implants are done slowly, over days, weeks, repeated gently. Did she seem uncomfortable when you said that? Do you ever wonder if you're too quick to assume? How often do people really tell you the truth? These questions don't demand answers. They don't need to. They just echo. And eventually, those echoes become self-narratives. The confident person becomes the cautious one. The loud voice becomes quieter. The fire turns into smoke. What makes this strategy dangerous isn't just its subtlety. It's the way it ties their growing uncertainty to you. Because once someone begins to doubt their own perception, they start relying on yours. They need your interpretations, your emotional readouts, your subtle approval to know whether they're still on the right track. You become their compass, and they don't even realize it. This is the long game of control, not through power, not through force, but through quiet erosion. It's the art of making someone unsure whether they're kind or manipulative, strong or selfish, honest or cruel. And the only way to regain footing, to feel certain again, is to come closer to you, to seek your reassurance, your judgment, your forgiveness. Reflective guilt implants create dependency. This is not theory. It's real. It happens in relationships, in workplaces, in families. A partner says, "I just thought you were more thoughtful than that." The guilt lands, not as rage, but as shame. A manager says, "That's one way to handle it, I suppose." And suddenly the employee second-guesses every decision. A parent sighs, "I know you meant well, but I expected better." And the child, now grown, still flinches when someone says, "We need to talk." It's not always malicious. Sometimes it's unconscious, a tactic inherited, a method absorbed through culture or trauma, but its effect is the same. It turns trust into a question mark, confidence into hesitation, and the need for autonomy into a need for validation. Reflective guilt implants are especially effective on people who pride themselves on being self-aware, because those are the people most likely to pause, to reflect, to reevaluate their behavior. They want to be good, to be fair, to be kind. And so, when you gently hint that maybe, just maybe, they weren't, they spiral, not because they're weak, but because they care. That's the trap. The more they care, the more the questions stick. Are you always this defensive? Why do you think people react to you like that? Have you noticed how often this happens with you? These questions frame reality as flawed, and them as the cause. And the only one who seems to understand, to decode the chaos, is you. That's why reflective guilt isn't just about planting shame. It's about positioning yourself as the answer. You subtly destroy their inner compass, and then offer your own in its place. They begin to watch your face when they speak. They pause before expressing disagreement. They apologize more, not because they believe they were wrong, but because they believe you might think so. And that's enough. What begins as a moment of self-awareness becomes a chronic dependency loop. They seek your validation before decisions. They fear your disappointment more than failure. Their self-trust dissolves, and in its place is you, quiet, patient, smiling as you ask, "Are you okay with how you handled that?" You don't need to say more. The damage is already done. This tactic, like all powerful tools, can be used ethically or destructively. A therapist might use gentle reflection to help a client see harmful patterns, but a manipulator uses it to rewrite the client's sense of self, to seed a guilt that never had to exist. And when that guilt matures into identity, I'm selfish, I'm unreliable, I always ruin things. The person becomes easier to steer, easier to please, easier to own. So, how do you spot it? How do you know when your self-doubt isn't yours? You start by asking, who made me question this? Was it a truth I uncovered, or a doubt someone placed? You retrace the source. Was there an event, or just a suggestion? Was there proof, or just a tone? Was the guilt based in fact, or in someone's sigh? And most of all, do I still trust myself when they're not watching? Because if you don't, if your decisions feel safer when they're around, if your self-worth shrinks when their voice is gone, then maybe the guilt you carry was never yours to begin with. Maybe someone else built it for you, brick by brick, question by question, until you lived in a house made of doubt and called it home. Reciprocity, mirage effect. It begins so simply. Someone asks for a favor, a ride, a review, a little help moving furniture, and you respond not with a yes, but with hesitation, a pause, a sigh, maybe even a gentle refusal. I don't know, I've got a lot on my plate right now. You appear reluctant, overwhelmed, unavailable. But then, after they plead or insist or even just pause, you suddenly concede. All right, I'll help you out, just this once. What just happened wasn't kindness. It wasn't sacrifice. It was the activation of the reciprocity mirage effect. On the surface, you've done someone a favor, but in reality, you've triggered something far more powerful, a feeling of debt. Not because the favor was extraordinary, but because you almost didn't give it. That moment of resistance, the illusion of refusal, creates a psychological distortion. It makes the eventual yes feel heavier, more costly, more meaningful than it truly was. The brain interprets it like this. They really didn't want to help me, but they did anyway. And from that comes an unspoken obligation, gratitude, guilt, and eventually, compliance. This is how the reciprocity mirage works. You create a phantom scarcity around your own generosity. You withhold help just long enough to make your acceptance feel rare, special, weighted with sacrifice. It's not manipulation in the aggressive sense. It's theatrical generosity, the kind that rewrites emotional contracts. Let's break this down. Human beings are hardwired to respond to reciprocity. When someone does something for us, especially when it appears to come at a personal cost, we feel compelled to repay them, even if no debt was explicitly stated. This is ancient, prehistoric. Reciprocity helped early humans survive in tribes. It kept relationships balanced, kept resources flowing, and punished freeloaders. But in modern life, this mechanism is easy to hijack, because now, the cost of a favor is often subjective, emotional, symbolic. That's where the mirage comes in. By appearing to sacrifice your time, your energy, your convenience, you amplify the weight of the favor. You turn a small gesture into a perceived burden. And because it looked like you didn't want to say yes, the person who received your help now feels two conflicting things: relief and guilt. Imagine this scenario. A colleague asks you to cover their shift. You pause, look concerned. I really shouldn't. I promised my partner I'd be home early. They start to pull back, embarrassed for asking. Then, just before the moment slips away, you say, "Okay, look, don't worry, I'll do it. But next time, just give me a little more notice." Now you've helped, but you've also gained leverage, social credit, emotional power. Not because of what you did, but because of how close you came to not doing it. That micro-theater of resistance transformed your help into something valuable, even noble. It felt expensive, and now they feel indebted. That feeling of indebtedness lingers, not because you asked for anything, but because the mirage planted a story. They gave up something for me. And when the time comes for you to ask a favor in return, their resistance will be lower. Their guilt will nudge them toward yes. They won't even recognize the source of their compliance. That's the beauty of the mirage. The moment it's complete, it disappears. This effect shows up in high-stakes environments too, in sales, negotiation, politics. A powerful version goes like this. The seller offers a discount, but only after pretending they were not allowed to. "I really shouldn't do this, but Let me speak to my manager. Suddenly the buyer feels like they've received something rare, valuable, hard-won, even if it was scripted from the start. And the buyer? They feel pressure, not just to accept, but to appreciate, to say thank you, to stop negotiating. Gratitude becomes compliance. The mirage makes it feel earned. Now, here's where it gets more dangerous. If used repeatedly, this tactic can shift a relationship's balance entirely. You become the person who always sacrifices, who always says yes, but only after a dramatic pause. People start to expect your initial no. They begin to read the script. But even then, the emotional impact remains, because humans don't measure generosity by effort alone. We measure it by what it looked like it cost. And that illusion can be curated. You can exaggerate your struggle, your schedule, your burden. You can make your yes look like a gift handed down reluctantly, even if it costs you nothing. And when people thank you with extra weight in their voice, when they feel guilty for asking, you'll know the mirage worked. But there's another side to this. Sometimes, people use this effect unconsciously. They hesitate because they genuinely don't want to help, but they give in anyway. Yet the impact is the same. The favor feels heavier. And because it felt reluctant, the receiver starts to carry guilt, even if no guilt was intended. So ask yourself, have you ever done this to someone? Delayed a yes just long enough to make it seem rare? Said things like, I'm not sure I should, or I usually wouldn't, but if so, you've stepped into the mirage, maybe without even realizing it. Or maybe you've been on the other side. Have you ever received help that felt so reluctant, so hard-earned, that you felt grateful even though you didn't ask for sacrifice? That you owed them something, not because of what they gave you, but because of how they acted while giving it? That's the mirage working in reverse. The theater of generosity performs its trick, and you find yourself applauding before you even question the stage. And what's most fascinating is this. The favor doesn't need to be big. It just needs to feel emotionally expensive. That's what creates gratitude that sticks. Not the act, but the apparent cost. And when you learn to control how that cost appears, when you control how close the no came before the yes, you don't just shape how people see you. You shape what they feel they owe. That's not just social skill. That's psychological architecture. In a world where favors are currency and emotional dynamics run deeper than words, the reciprocity mirage isn't just a tactic. It's a lens, a way of seeing that every yes has a shadow, and that sometimes the shadow speaks louder than the gift itself. Micro-agreement, cascade. Have you ever said yes, and then found yourself saying yes again and again, until suddenly you were agreeing to something you never would have agreed to in isolation? That wasn't coincidence. That was design. It's called the micro-agreement cascade, a manipulation so subtle, so rhythmic, that by the time the real question arrives, your brain is already nodding before your conscience catches up. Here's how it works. We are pattern-seeking creatures. We love momentum. And we especially love consistency. So, when we say yes to one thing, we're more likely to say yes to the next, and the next, and the next. This isn't about logic. It's about inertia. Start small. Is today Monday? Yes. You're watching this on your phone, right? Yes. It's been a long week, hasn't it? Yes. You've just said yes 3 times. You've built a pattern. Now, here comes the ask. Then you'd probably be open to something that makes life a little easier, right? Without realizing it, your brain has slipped into a compliance loop. The yes response isn't being evaluated anymore. It's flowing, on rhythm, not reason. That's the cascade, and it works everywhere. Salespeople use it constantly. Do you like saving money? Yes. Would you want faster service? Yes. Do you wish your internet was more reliable? Yes. Well, then you'll love our premium upgrade. It feels logical, but it's not. It's psychological momentum. Your agreement isn't about the offer. It's about your brain staying in motion. This technique is older than advertising. Ancient rhetoricians knew it. Cult leaders mastered it. Door-to-door evangelists refined it. Because once you've said yes 3 or 4 times, something dangerous happens. Your critical faculties soften. Your brain, craving consistency, wants to align with your previous answers. Saying no would break the pattern, and we hate breaking patterns. It's why magicians get you nodding along before the final reveal. It's why cult recruiters ask, don't you want peace? Don't you wish the world was more just? Don't you feel like something's missing? By the time they introduce the belief system, you're already half inside. It's not persuasion, it's erosion. One tiny yes at a time. In behavioral psychology, this is related to the foot in the door effect. Get someone to agree to a small request, and they're more likely to agree to a bigger one. But micro-agreement cascades are faster, more rhythmic. They don't build trust, they build rhythm. And rhythm bypasses logic. Think of a song you can't stop tapping your foot to. Your body responds before you analyze the beat. Micro-agreements do the same. They create cognitive music. And here's where it turns dangerous, because not all cascades are innocent. Sometimes they're used in high-pressure negotiations, sometimes in abusive relationships. Do you love me? Yes. Do you want me to be happy? Yes. Do you trust me? Yes. Then why won't you do this one thing for me? The cascade closes around you like a velvet trap. You didn't agree to the final ask based on its merits. You agreed to preserve the harmony. That's the hidden force. We mistake agreement rhythm for agreement reason. Even in casual conversations, people stack micro-agreements to guide opinions. Don't you think people deserve freedom? Yes. And fairness? Yes. And safety? Yes. Then don't you think we should all support this policy? Agreement becomes a social reflex. It's not about trickery alone. It's about mental economy. When we're tired, distracted, or emotionally vulnerable, our brains opt for the path of least resistance. Saying yes keeps the peace. It avoids confrontation. It makes us feel agreeable. But slowly, it can cost us clarity. In some experiments, participants were asked a series of innocuous yes-no questions, followed by a morally ambiguous request. Those who had said yes multiple times before were statistically far more likely to agree, even when their values didn't align. Why? Because they'd been lulled into the current. It's like walking down a hill. Each step is easy, but soon the slope controls your pace. So, what do? First, recognize the rhythm. When you feel yourself saying yes too quickly, pause. Second, isolate the final ask. Would you say yes to it on its own, without the warm-up? And third, break the pattern. A deliberate, let me think about that, snaps the trance. Micro-agreement. Cascades are powerful, but they only work when your mind drifts into autopilot. Awareness is the exit, because the next time someone stacks those tiny yes questions, they may not be leading you toward agreement. They might be leading you away from yourself. Illusion of scarcity. Imagine a merchant at the edge of an open-air market. His stall is small, neatly arranged. A single rug hangs behind him, not cluttered with signs or clamor. He speaks little. He doesn't call to passers-by. In fact, he seems almost too still, content to be overlooked. But the fabric he sells is fine. The dye, rich. The supply, limited. And quietly, without urgency, a line begins to form. People lean in closer. They wonder how long he will stay, whether there's enough for them, whether they're already too late. And so, they ask to buy. This is not an accident. It is the illusion of scarcity. Not scarcity itself, but the appearance of it. The suggestion that your time, your energy, your presence is rare. That what you offer, even when minimal, is not easily gained again. It's a pattern as old as any marketplace. But it's not limited to trade. It seeps into friendships, courtships, leadership, and influence. People want what seems elusive. It is about perception. In ancient Athens, the philosopher Socrates was known for disappearing for stretches of time. When he returned to the agora, people gathered around, not just for his ideas, but for the rarity of his presence. He didn't offer wisdom at all hours. He let curiosity grow in his absence. And when he finally spoke, his words felt heavier. Much later, in 18th century France, a trend developed among salon hosts, the deliberate restriction of invitations. Some gatherings were impossibly exclusive. The conversation might have been unremarkable, but it was the difficulty of gaining entry that created its allure. People longed to attend, not for what happened there, but because so few could. And the hostess, often saying little herself, became the center of attention, precisely because she seemed just beyond it. Even in everyday relationships, this dynamic lingers. The person who replies slowly, who isn't always available, whose approval is not freely given, becomes magnetic. Not because they are better, but because they seem rarer. Imagine again, a friend who always listens, always agrees, always answers the phone. Comforting, yes, but predictable. Now imagine someone who listens just enough, who offers attention in small doses. Each moment feels more significant, each text more deliberate. The difference is not content, it is pacing. Throughout history, influence has often relied on this illusion. Leaders, monarchs, even spiritual figures have used distance as a tool. The emperor who appears rarely on the palace balcony. The priest who offers counsel only after ritual. The teacher who speaks only when silence has fallen. Their words are few, but they are remembered. In medieval England, the concept of the king's progress served this purpose. The monarch would travel the countryside, rarely staying long. His presence was a gift, a glimpse, a sign of favor. By appearing briefly and moving on, he created a sense of scarcity. People valued the visit not because it brought anything tangible, but because it might not happen again. In Japanese tea ceremonies, a similar idea unfolds in miniature. Each element, the sound of water, the placement of a cup, the host's movements, is deliberate and slow. Nothing is rushed. Nothing is over-offered. And that scarcity of motion, of speech, creates a kind of reverence. You listen more closely. You notice more. This scarcity need not be artificial. It can be a boundary, a choice, to protect energy, to move with intention. But once noticed, it becomes a signal to others that your presence is not an obligation, that your attention must be earned or at least noticed when given. And so, paradoxically, what you offer becomes more desired, not because it changed, but because of how little of it seems available. It is not about withholding affection or generosity. It is about pacing them, offering warmth, then quiet, insight, then pause, approval, then retreat. Not to punish, but to preserve contrast. Because without contrast, presence becomes background noise. Imagine a room filled with bells, all ringing at once. You cannot hear the melody. But if one bell chimes, only once, then stops, it lingers. You hear it still. That's the illusion of scarcity. It makes the ordinary seem rare. The small act, a glance, a compliment, a brief reply, feels amplified because it's surrounded by silence. Even today in digital spaces, the pattern persists. The influencer who posts infrequently, the expert who rarely speaks, but when they do, people listen. The friend who doesn't flood a group chat, but whose single message sparks a dozen replies. None of this requires performance. It requires rhythm. The illusion of scarcity is not about pretending to be busy. It's about choosing when to engage, making space around your presence so it can be felt. And that space, that pause, is what makes people lean in. Perception compression lens. They only forgot a small detail. Maybe they were late once, missed a deadline, said the wrong thing in a meeting. Nothing huge, something that could happen to anyone. But then you looked at them, just a little too long. You said nothing harsh, just a quiet, thoughtful line. I'm starting to wonder if you always struggle with responsibility. And in that moment, their world shifted. This is the perception compression lens, a psychological pressure tactic that frames one small flaw as a symptom of a much deeper failure. You don't accuse them. You just reframe their mistake, not as an isolated event, but as part of a larger pattern. You compress their identity down to a weakness, and then, silently, you wait for them to correct you. Not with words, but with performance. Here's why it works. Human beings are constantly managing perception. We don't just want to do well, we want others to believe we're doing well. A mistake by itself is manageable, but being seen as flawed, that's unbearable. And so, when someone implies that your small error reveals something about who you really are, your instincts fire into overdrive, not to fix the mistake, but to fix the image. This response is more powerful than guilt, more lasting than shame, because the person being targeted starts trying to reverse a narrative that was never fully spoken out loud. They start overperforming, overcompensating, working harder, smiling wider, apologizing for things you never blamed them for. Because in their mind, they are no longer just trying to do better. They are trying to undo an entire label that was dropped like a shadow over who they are. And here's the catch. The label doesn't have to be true. It only has to linger. This is how the compression lens operates. You zoom in on a moment. Then you suggest, softly, indirectly, that this moment might be a window into their deeper character. That's the second time you've done that. Is follow-through something you've always struggled with? The sentence isn't aggressive. It's curious, even gentle. But it plants a seed. A narrative begins to form. Not just about the mistake, but about them. In psychology, this taps into a phenomenon known as self-verification theory. People will go to extreme lengths to protect the identity they believe they hold, and even greater lengths to protect the identity they want others to see in them. So, if someone sees them as unreliable, careless, selfish, they'll bend over backwards to prove otherwise, not because they were manipulated, but because they feel like they're writing their own redemption arc. And this is where the tactic becomes manipulation, because it creates a loop. Compress, imply, observe, receive effort. And the more they overperform, the more the manipulator reaps the rewards: loyalty, submission, perfectionism, obedience. Let's walk through an example. In a relationship, your partner forgets to text you back one afternoon. Instead of mentioning the forgotten message, you look slightly disappointed and quietly murmur, "I'm starting to feel like I care more than you do." That comment doesn't address the act. It attacks the pattern. It redefines the silence not as an accident, but as proof of emotional imbalance. The next day, your partner overcorrects. They send long messages. Check in more often. They bring you flowers. Not because they want to, but because they need to repair the perception you framed. And if you smile quietly and reward their extra effort, they'll do it again. You've installed a reflex. Now they're afraid of looking careless, even when they're not. This tactic shows up in management too. A team member makes a single error, and the supervisor says, "I'm starting to think this level of attention to detail might just not be your strength." That employee now works overtime. Triple checks everything. Not because they were asked, but because they need to outrun the shadow of that phrase. Not to fix the report, to fix the reflection of themselves in someone else's eyes. In families, it's even more subtle. A parent raises an eyebrow and says, "I've noticed you tend to give up on things pretty quickly, don't you?" And now the child pushes through projects they hate, resists quitting things they should have walked away from, just to prove they aren't what that sentence suggested. But here's the truth. The mistake never defined them. The perception did. That's the compression. You take a wide, complex identity and squeeze it into a single flaw, and you do it through implication, not accusation. The most powerful version of this tactic never raises its voice. It speaks in disappointment, concern, doubt, and the target responds, not with anger, but with action, because no one wants to be misunderstood, especially not by someone whose opinion they value. And this is the dangerous beauty of it. You never told them to work harder. You never demanded obedience. You just planted a frame, and they walked into it, trying to shatter the mirror you held up. So, how do you defend against it? First, learn to spot the reframing. If someone takes your small error and links it to a trait, pause. "You're always like this. You never follow through. This is so typical of you." These are phrases that seek not to correct, but to compress. Ask yourself, is the mistake real, or is the pattern being imagined? Second, reclaim complexity. No single act defines you. You can forget once and still be thoughtful. Fail once and still be competent. Speak sharply and still be kind. Identity is not a snapshot, it's a film. And one bad frame doesn't tell the whole story. And finally, don't perform for people who weaponize perception. If someone makes you feel like you need to prove your goodness after every stumble, they're not guiding you. They're grooming your behavior to serve their standards. Let your actions speak for you, but let them come from your truth, not your need to rewrite someone else's judgment. Because once someone compresses you into a flaw, they'll never let you expand back into your full self, and no amount of overachievement will make them see you clearly again. Compassion, withdrawal, a wall hook. It always begins with kindness, a softness, a presence that feels safe, attentive, emotionally open. The way someone leans in when you speak, how their eyes don't drift, how their voice is laced with comfort. It feels rare, maybe even sacred. You think, they see me. And then, they don't. They go silent. Pull back. The warmth that once surrounded you becomes absence, Not cruelty, just nothing. A void where connection once lived. You're left reeling, scanning yourself for what you did wrong, replaying the last conversation, wondering what shifted, and most of all, what you need to do to bring that warmth back. This is the compassion withdrawal hook, a psychological mechanism designed not to destroy, but to control. Not by attacking your ego, but by training your nervous system to seek their empathy like oxygen. They give you the emotional connection your mind craves, and then teach you that they control its supply. At its core, this tactic operates like addiction, a carefully timed cycle of reward and deprivation. First, you're seen, held, valued. Then, without warning, that emotional mirror is snatched away. You panic, you reach, you apologize for things you're not sure you did. You begin to shape yourself, not to be loved, but to be re-loved, to re-earn a warmth that never should have been conditional in the first place. And this is where control begins, because humans are hardwired for emotional regulation through connection. When someone makes you feel deeply understood, your body stores that memory as safety. When that same person suddenly withdraws, no explanation, no confrontation, your body interprets it as threat. But unlike physical threat, there's no clear enemy, no injury, just uncertainty, emotional whiplash. So you blame yourself. You become more cautious with your words, more agreeable. You avoid tension. You perform softness to avoid the cold. And every once in a while they give it back. The warmth, the kindness, the praise. And it feels even better than before. Because now, it's earned. But it's not love. It's leverage. Compassion withdrawal turns normal conflict into moral failure. A sigh becomes a punishment. Silence becomes guilt. You begin to anticipate their withdrawal and pre-correct your behavior to avoid it. Not because they told you to, but because you've been trained to fear the void. In this way, they become your emotional thermostat. Too cold, you panic. Too warm, you cling. The balance is never in your hands, and it doesn't require rage, insults, or aggression. In fact, the more subtle the withdrawal, the more effective the hook. A slow decline in texts, a sudden lack of curiosity in your day, a shift in facial tone from soft to blank. These micro-abandonments don't break the relationship, they bind it. Because you begin to work harder for what once came freely. They've made their empathy a prize, and you become a contestant in a game you didn't agree to play. This dynamic can form anywhere: romantic partners, mentors, even therapists. It's most powerful when the relationship is built on emotional vulnerability, when you've shared your shadows, your fears, your past. And now, all of that is being held hostage, not with threats, but with silence. You want the version of them who once said, "You're safe here." But they're gone. And the silence says, "Maybe you never were." The tragedy of the compassion withdrawal hook is that it turns the healthiest need, connection, into a weapon. And you never see it coming because it feels like love at first. Maybe even the purest love you've known. But genuine compassion doesn't disappear as punishment. True empathy doesn't teach you that care is conditional. When someone uses your need for connection to control you, they're not loving you, they're programming you. Teaching your nervous system that safety is a transaction, and they hold the currency. And when that belief sets in, you stop asking, "Why am I treated like this?" and start asking, "What did I do to deserve it?" That shift is the moment you stop being a partner, friend, or peer, and start becoming a subject of emotional rule. The withdrawal doesn't always come after conflict. Sometimes, it follows a moment of deep connection, a vulnerable truth, a moment where you felt most open, and that's when the hook embeds deepest. Because it teaches you that intimacy itself is dangerous, that every time you show your real self, you risk losing the connection you most cherish. So you shrink. You become more curated, more agreeable. You offer surface smiles. You censor your needs. You withhold your pain. And when they give you a breadcrumb of warmth again, you convince yourself it's enough, that they're just processing, busy, hurt, complicated. You give them empathy they no longer offer you. You write stories to protect the hand that tightens the leash. But here's the truth they don't want you to see. Their love was never gone. It was stored, controlled, ready to be dispensed when you're obedient again. Their silence isn't absence, it's design. A form of punishment without accusation. A form of dominance without force. Because when someone becomes your only source of warmth, they never need to raise their voice. All they have to do is step away, and you'll do the rest. You'll chase, apologize, edit, suppress, perform, because they've taught you that you are responsible for their compassion. But you're not. Compassion that vanishes with non-compliance was never compassion. It was a hook, coated in kindness, sharpened by silence. And the moment you stop scrambling to re-earn it, you'll feel the wound they left behind begin to close. Preemptive justification. Plant. You sit across from them. They shift in their chair, glance away, hesitate. You already know what they're about to do, or maybe what they have already done. But instead of waiting for the excuse, instead of letting them speak first, you say it for them. Softly. Kindly. I mean, it makes sense. You were under a lot of pressure. Anyone would have snapped. And in that moment, without realizing it, they nod. Maybe not physically. Maybe just internally. But something in them lets go. The tension slips. Their guilt softens. And they quietly, wordlessly accept the narrative you just handed them. That's the preemptive justification plant. It's not persuasion in the traditional sense. It's not arguing or debating or trying to change someone's mind. It's subtler than that. It's the art of giving someone a reason before they offer one themselves, framing their actions before they get a chance to define them. And if done correctly, it doesn't feel like control, it feels like understanding. The brilliance of this technique lies in its timing. It comes early. So early, in fact, that the person doesn't realize they've adopted your narrative until it's already become their own. Because most people don't walk into a conversation with a fully formed explanation of their behavior. They come with emotion, with tension, with uncertainty. The story forms as they speak. And if you offer a frame before that story solidifies, their brain will often slip into it, simply because it's there. Think about this. The human mind craves coherence. It wants its actions to make sense, to appear rational, even if they weren't. And when someone hands us a clean, simple, sympathetic explanation for something we ourselves are still processing, it's incredibly tempting to accept it. Let's say someone shows up late to an important meeting. You could wait for their excuse, or you could gently offer one first. Traffic must have been insane this morning. You didn't accuse them. You didn't pressure them. You gave them an out. And unless they need to correct you, they'll likely just nod and say, "Yeah, it really was." But here's where it gets interesting. Maybe the real reason they were late had nothing to do with traffic. Maybe they just overslept. Maybe they didn't want to come. But now that you've planted the traffic excuse, that's the narrative that settles. They've escaped judgment, and you've quietly taken control of how the story is remembered. This effect deepens when emotions run high. Suppose a friend lashes out at you, harsh words, sharp tone. Later, when things have calmed, you say, "I know you didn't mean that. You've just been under so much stress lately." And just like that, their behavior isn't labeled as cruel. It's labeled as overwhelmed. Not because they said so, but because you did. It's a subtle shift, but a powerful one. You've controlled the emotional lens through which the event is remembered. And because you offered a kind, generous interpretation, they're far less likely to challenge it. In fact, they'll likely lean into it. And every time they revisit that memory, it'll be your version they recall. That's the quiet force of the preemptive justification plant. You're not rewriting the truth. You're planting the first draft. Now ask yourself, how often has someone done this to you? How often has a friend, a boss, a partner said something like, "I know you're not avoiding me, you're just really busy lately," before you even had a chance to explain yourself? And didn't part of you feel relieved, maybe even grateful? That relief is the hook. That's where the influence begins. And it doesn't stop at simple interactions. In more strategic hands, this tactic becomes a form of soft power. In negotiations, leaders might say things like, "I understand why your team pushed back. It's probably because they're trying to protect their interests." That one sentence takes tension off the table. It gives the opposition a face-saving reason to cooperate. You've provided the excuse and made it feel rational, which makes them far more likely to agree with you moving forward. Even in apologies, this tactic sneaks in. "I'm sorry I snapped. I know you were just trying to help." That line, hidden in a sorry, defines the other person's role in the conflict. You've planted their justification for being in your space, whether or not they asked for it. And once planted, it shapes the emotional outcome of the exchange. The effectiveness of this method comes from one basic truth. Most people want to feel understood more than they want to be right. When you offer them an understanding before they've even asked for it, you're not just showing empathy, you're guiding the shape of their own memory, their own accountability, and ultimately their own narrative. But there's a darker side too. When used manipulatively, the preemptive justification plant can be a way to erase accountability, to let people off the hook for things they should have owned. Imagine someone betrays you, and before you can react, they say, "Look, I didn't mean to hurt you. I was scared. I didn't know what else to do." They've offered their excuse before you could respond. And now, if you push back, you become the aggressor. You're fighting against a person who's already framed themselves as vulnerable. That's the trap. When someone gives your justification before you do, it's hard to break out of it, because rejecting it doesn't just mean correcting a story. It means creating tension. And most people will do anything to avoid tension. So they nod. They accept. And the seed takes root. Over time, this tactic can rewrite entire relationships. If someone always offers the reason for you, you slowly lose the impulse to explain yourself. You begin to defer, to trust their framing. And eventually, you stop questioning why you feel the way you do, because they already told you. It's subtle, it's kind, and it's strategic. So next time you find yourself about to explain your actions, stop. Ask yourself, did I decide this narrative, or was it planted? And when you're on the other side, listening to someone stumble toward guilt, confusion, or defensiveness, remember the power of what you say before they do. You're not just offering comfort, you're writing the first chapter of their memory. And that kind of authorship, that's power most people never realize they gave away. You can give someone their dignity, or their denial. You can shape their guilt into grace, or quietly dilute it until nothing remains. All with a single, well-timed sentence. That's the preemptive justification plant. Not a defense, not an excuse. A mirror that shows them what they need to believe, before they've even looked. Selective transparency to leak. Sometimes, the most powerful form of manipulation isn't a lie. It's a carefully chosen truth. Not the whole truth, just enough to earn trust, just enough to lower defenses, while the rest remains quietly hidden. This is the tactic of selective transparency leak. It feels honest, it sounds genuine, but it's engineered. Every word you're allowed to hear is a calculated release, measured, intentional, incomplete. Imagine a glass window smeared with fingerprints. Someone wipes one clean section and says, "See? Nothing to hide." And you believe them. Because what they've shown you is real, just not complete. That's the core of selective transparency. Omission disguised as openness. In a world that craves authenticity, people have learned how to weaponize it. The tactic works by offering vulnerability in doses. Confessions that seem brave, secrets that seem intimate, while strategically withholding what would actually shift the power dynamic. A politician admits to youthful mistakes, but doesn't mention the ongoing investigations. A CEO opens up about mental health, but not about the layoffs planned next quarter. A partner tells you they once cheated in a past relationship, but leaves out that it happened again recently. And in each case, the disclosure feels raw, real, disarming. But that's the point, because once you believe someone is being vulnerable, your defense is lower. You stop looking for hidden motives. You stop asking deeper questions. You assume that if they were hiding something, they wouldn't have told you anything at all. This is the brilliance and the danger of the tactic. It mimics sincerity. It rewards curiosity with just enough truth to feel like discovery. It frames the speaker as trustworthy, precisely because they shared. But selective transparency isn't about sharing. It's about steering. Every leak shapes the narrative. The teller remains in control, choosing what parts of the iceberg to reveal and what to leave submerged. It's why in cults or high-control groups, leaders often tell personal stories of struggle, loss, redemption. You hear about their childhood pain, their broken past, their moments of weakness, and you think, they're just like me. But what you're not told is how they manipulate finances, or silence dissent, or exploit loyalty. You were shown just enough to bond, but never enough to see the truth. In sales, selective transparency shows up too. The rep tells you, "I'll be honest, this model does have fewer features than the premium one." And you think, wow, They're being straight with me, but they don't mention the customer complaints, the warranty loopholes, the hidden fees. You've been disarmed, not by lies, but by strategically placed honesty. Even in personal relationships, this tactic unfolds gently. A friend says, "I haven't been completely upfront with you," and then admits something small, even embarrassing. You appreciate the courage, you feel closer, but you don't realize that was the decoy. The real issue, the betrayal, the intention, the deeper truth, is still behind glass. And now, you're less likely to look, because vulnerability has been used as camouflage. In psychology, this relates to a principle called preemptive disclosure bias. When someone reveals a flaw first, we assume they're more honest, even if that disclosure distracts us from greater flaws they never mention. It's misdirection with emotional currency, and it's devastatingly effective, because most people are wired to reward honesty. We crave connection. We want to believe that when someone opens up, it means they trust us. But in a manipulation setting, that trust is artificial. The speaker doesn't trust you. They want you to trust them. And so, they leak a truth. A single card from a stacked deck. You see the ace, you assume the rest must be fair, but the deck was rigged long before the game began. So, how do you defend yourself? First, notice timing. If someone reveals a personal truth right before making a request, delivering news, or defending themselves, it might not be a confession. It might be a setup. Second, analyze gaps. What are they not saying? If their story feels clean, rehearsed, or too perfectly shaped, look closer. Real truth is messy. Controlled transparency often isn't. And third, don't mistake detail for depth. Just because something sounds raw doesn't mean it's the full picture. People can cry while hiding everything. They can bleed honesty and still bury the wound. Selective transparency isn't about facts. It's about framing. It's about using honesty as a lure, not a bridge. So, the next time someone opens up to you, ask yourself, was that truth meant to bring us closer? Or was it meant to keep me just far enough away from what they didn't say? Social proof mirage. Imagine walking into a crowded hall. Candles flicker overhead. You hear murmurs, laughter, quiet agreements exchanged in low voices. You're unsure where to stand, what to say. But then someone leans in and says, "Most people here feel the same way." They don't explain, they don't name names, but something shifts. You nod, you align, you begin to feel less alone. And more importantly, less likely to speak against what you now believe others already accept. This is the social proof mirage. It's not real consensus. It's the suggestion of one, a gentle illusion. The idea that others already agree, that most people, perhaps even everyone, already feels a certain way, and you are simply catching up. This suggestion changes how people act, not by force, not by logic, but by comfort. The mirage is subtle, a turn of phrase. They're all saying it. Everyone's been talking about this. We've all felt the same. Phrases without substance, but with powerful consequences. The listener, uncertain, drifts toward the imagined crowd, and the imagined crowd begins to feel real. The roots of this go deep. In early tribal societies, survival depended on belonging. To be in harmony with the group meant protection. To stand apart meant risk. And so, the brain evolved a shortcut. If others seem to believe something, follow. If others are moving in a direction, move with them. But in time, the signals of consensus became easy to fake. In ancient Rome, public support was often staged. Politicians hired actors, called claques, to cheer, to laugh, to murmur approval at speeches, to make it seem as if the masses were already convinced. A senator could enter the forum with 50 trained voices applauding before a single policy had been debated. To the undecided, it felt like joining something already in motion. It felt safe. This wasn't deception in the traditional sense. It was theater, a performance of agreement designed to trigger real agreement. Centuries later, in the crowded coffee houses of 17th century London, this pattern returned. Pamphlets were published with anonymous testimonials. Everyone is reading it. Scholars agree. The mood of the city has turned. These phrases created no actual evidence, only suggestion, but they worked. People read what they believed others were reading. They believed what they thought the majority already accepted. Not because it was true, but because the alternative was to risk standing alone. The social proof mirage is not just political, It lives in fashion, in etiquette, in belief. It is the reason new trends feel old by the time you notice them. The reason a phrase or behavior spreads, not because it's logical, but because it's framed as familiar. Imagine a noblewoman in 18th century France arriving at a salon. A subtle whisper tells her, "Everyone has begun wearing darker silks." Whether or not this is true, she feels it. And in the days that follow, she changes her wardrobe. Others see her. They believe the same whisper. And within weeks, the false observation has become reality. This is the strange power of the mirage. It often makes itself true. Once people begin to believe that everyone agrees, they do. Slowly, quietly, through imitation. In Eastern philosophy, there's an old parable. A traveler enters a town and sees a long line outside a shop. He joins it. Others join as well. Eventually, the shopkeeper asks what they want. The traveler replies, "I don't know, I saw the line." No one needed a reason. They only needed the impression of agreement. Social proof works best when it's invisible, when the majority isn't shown, but implied. A shrug, a smile, a phrase like, "We all understand why." The listener feels left out until they step in line. It's not manipulation by threat. It's manipulation by atmosphere. In modern terms, this lives in online spaces. A post labeled trending becomes popular, not because of its merit, but because it appears already liked. Comments with invisible upvotes rise to the top. A video marked as viral gains views because it's been called viral. The mirage is the label. The social proof is simulated. And still, people follow. But even in daily life, the effect is present. Imagine a group of friends debating where to eat. One says, "Everyone's been talking about the new place on Elm Street." No evidence is offered, no names are listed, but the sentence softens the room. The others agree. Why? Because to question it feels like questioning not just an opinion, but a group. That's the danger. The mirage doesn't need to be accurate. It only needs to be plausible. And once it takes hold, people adjust to it, even if they are the only ones who ever truly believed it. This illusion can be used gently, to encourage cooperation, to promote calm, but it can also be used to suppress dissent, to suggest that protest is lonely. That doubt is rare. That silence means agreement. When in truth, the silence might simply be shared uncertainty. Imagine again the crowded hall, the soft murmur of voices, the suggestion that everyone agrees. You hesitate. You lower your voice. You nod. But perhaps no one truly agreed at all. Only one person said it, and now everyone believes it. Delayed validation bait. They work hard, long hours, full effort. Maybe they do everything right, on paper, but when they look to you for recognition, you pause. You say nothing. Or worse, you nod slightly and change the subject. No smile, no warmth. Just silence wrapped in indifference. And then, hours or days later, when they've given even more, when exhaustion starts to show, you give it. A compliment, a gesture, a line of praise that feels like water in the desert. Not too much, just enough to keep them going. That's the delayed validation bait. A psychological conditioning technique designed not to reward performance, but to stretch it, to make someone chase approval with more intensity than they chase the task itself, to shift their internal motivation from purpose to permission. Here's how it works. The human brain is wired to seek validation. We learn from infancy that approval means safety. Smiles, praise, attention, they shape behavior faster than punishment. And in a healthy system, feedback is timely and sincere. It says, "You did something valuable, and I see you." But when validation is delayed, when it arrives just a little too late, and only after we've pushed ourselves further than necessary, it does something different. It teaches the brain that effort is not enough, that maybe the next level will be enough, that if we just keep going, eventually, we'll be worthy. And this is where it becomes manipulation, because now we're not working toward a goal, we're working toward approval. The approval becomes the goal. This tactic is often masked as high standards. You hear things like, "You're not quite there yet," or "Let's see how consistent you can be," or the classic, "I don't hand out compliments easily." And when the praise finally arrives, after you've given more than you thought you could, it feels earned, like you unlocked something, like you passed an invisible test. But what you actually passed was a boundary. You gave more than you needed to. And the person who made you wait just taught you that their praise is rare, valuable, and addictive. This tactic shows up in romantic relationships all the time. You go out of your way for them. Cook dinner, send long messages, make plans. You hope they'll notice, that they'll say something. But they don't. Not really. Maybe a quick thanks, maybe nothing at all. Then, days later, they mention that they liked it, that it meant something. But by then, you've already done 3 more things trying to fill that silence. And now you've learned. Their approval is possible, but you have to earn it the hard way. Over and over. In that moment, the chase begins. It happens in workplaces too. A boss withholds praise until employees exceed expectations. Not once, but repeatedly. They set the bar just out of reach. Every time you hit the target, they move it slightly. And when they finally say, "You've done well," it hits like a drug. Not because it's sincere, but because it's so rare, so carefully rationed that it becomes sacred. What's happening is reinforcement conditioning, but unlike a healthy reward loop, this one is intermittent, unpredictable. You never know when it's coming. That uncertainty activates the same psychological response found in gambling addiction. It's called variable reward. The idea that inconsistent payoff creates more effort, more obsession than consistent reward ever could. And now, your brain is hooked. You start asking, was that good enough? Did I do okay? Are they proud of me? And you wait for the nod, the word, the smile, the dopamine. You become trained to perform for the hope of approval, not the joy of creation, not the meaning of the task, but that moment of validation. The manipulator becomes the dispenser, the gatekeeper of your worth. And this tactic doesn't always come from malice. Some people genuinely don't know how to give praise. They withhold it because it makes them uncomfortable, or they believe it makes them look weak. But others use it with precision. They know that giving you just enough to keep going, without ever fully satisfying your need, is the perfect way to control your pace, your effort, and your emotional attachment to them. Because now, you're not just working hard, you're waiting. And waiting turns people inward. It makes them doubt, recalculate. It makes them say things like, maybe if I just try harder. And that harder becomes the new baseline, the standard you now feel responsible to maintain, just to stay in their favor. So, how do you break free? You stop tying your self-worth to other people's clocks. You stop waiting for a praise that comes late, dry, and reluctantly. You recognize that any system which rewards you after exhaustion is not praise, it's bait. Any person who makes you perform more just to get what should have come honestly is not a mentor, not a leader, not a lover. They're a puppeteer pulling threads of approval like they're rations. Start validating yourself in real time. Look at your work and name its value. Look at your effort and feel it, without waiting for someone else to confirm it. Surround yourself with people who recognize good when they see it, and say it while it's still warm. Because the truth is, praise shouldn't feel like a privilege. It's not a luxury item you have to bleed for. It should feel like sunlight. Simple, generous, and human. The delayed validation bait isn't about excellence. It's about control. And the moment you stop chasing the nod is the moment you remember how much you already gave, and you'll see clearly it was always enough. Cognitive overload, that slip. It doesn't look like manipulation. It looks like chaos, like urgency, like a flood of facts, emotions, what-ifs, and fast-ticking clocks. It sounds like someone talking too fast, listing details you can't track, raising stakes you didn't agree to, painting outcomes that make your head spin. You don't know what the real decision is anymore. You just want the pressure to stop. And that's when you say yes. That's when the suggestion, the real suggestion, slides in under the weight of your overloaded mind. This is the cognitive overload slip, a psychological tactic that uses the mind's own limits against it. It doesn't persuade you by logic. It doesn't threaten you with fear. It drowns your critical thinking in noise. Then, whispers a directive when you're too flooded to notice. Because here's the truth. The human brain is a brilliant machine, but it has a bandwidth limit, especially under stress, especially during moments of heightened emotion. When the amygdala fires and cortisol rises, the prefrontal cortex, the seat of reasoning, begins to shut down. And in that narrow window, whoever controls the narrative controls you. Imagine a partner starts a heated argument, then rapidly floods you with everything at once. And you didn't even call back last Tuesday, Plus, remember how you forgot my birthday last year? And you said you'd help with the rent, and now we're short. And by the way, I saw that message on your phone, and now your mom wants to visit again, and that's a whole mess. And I swear, if this keeps happening, maybe we just shouldn't live together anymore. There it is. The real suggestion. Hidden. Maybe we just shouldn't live together, but you're not thinking about that. You're caught in the storm. Emotionally off balance, mentally overwhelmed, your brain scanning for relief, any relief. And if relief looks like agreeing, you'll agree. Not because you believe them, not because you decided, but because you were too full to resist. This tactic doesn't work by shouting a single command. It works by hiding the command inside the noise, like slipping a needle into a waterfall. You won't see it, but it still cuts. Salespeople use it. Politicians use it. Abusers use it. They overload the emotional and informational circuits, then bury their true goal in the mix. In a negotiation, look, the market's unstable, the supply chain's already delayed 3 months, and you know the Q4 numbers are going to tank unless we move fast. This isn't just about now, it's about securing next year's leverage. Honestly, if we don't sign this today, we're looking at major risk exposure by Friday. Buried in the frenzy, sign this today. You didn't choose it, you surrendered to it. That's the cognitive overload slip. It feels like panic. It feels like drowning. It's the sense that if you don't decide now, something terrible will happen. And that thought itself is planted by the speaker. And you don't realize they're doing it, because overload doesn't feel like manipulation. It feels like urgency. It feels like information. It feels like being a responsible adult under pressure. And the more conscientious you are, the more you try to respond logically, while your logic is being dismantled in real time. The key to this technique is timing. The slip must occur when you're already compromised. Maybe you're grieving, angry, ashamed, confused. That's when the details come. Fast, layered, unrelenting. Maybe it's a wall of financial consequences, a moral guilt trip, a list of past mistakes, a threat disguised as a prediction, all at once, until you lose the ability to track what's being asked of you, until you agree to something just to stop the noise. And the next day, when the fog clears, you've made a decision you can't reverse. You moved out, signed the deal, gave away the secret, said yes to something you never wanted, and you don't even remember the exact moment you gave in. That's the brilliance and the horror of this tactic. It hijacks your mental processes without a single lie. It doesn't fabricate, it overwhelms. So how do you fight it? You train yourself to pause, not during calm, but during chaos. The moment someone bombards you with too many facts, too many emotions, too much urgency, that is the red flag. Not the words, the rhythm, the flood, the speed. You learn to say, let me think, even when you feel like you shouldn't, especially when you feel like you shouldn't. Because if someone's truth can't survive your silence, it wasn't truth, it was pressure. And if a decision must be made now, it usually means you're not supposed to think, you're supposed to obey. Don't. Step back. Ask, what's really being asked of me? What's the hidden directive beneath the storm? Because when someone floods your brain to make a request, they've already told you they don't want your clarity. They want your confusion. And if you give it to them, they'll use it to walk you into a decision you didn't make, with consequences you'll carry. All because you didn't see the slip. Presumed intimacy bias. You've just met someone, maybe minutes ago, and yet they speak to you like an old friend. Their tone is warm, familiar. They laugh easily, maybe touch your arm lightly when they say something personal. And then suddenly, they share something deep, maybe about a childhood trauma, or a recent breakup, or their struggle with self-worth. And before you can process what's happening, you feel drawn in, trusted, special. But here's what really happened. You weren't chosen because you're safe, or because you earned that trust. You were placed inside a mental illusion, a strategy called the presumed intimacy bias, where the illusion of closeness is manufactured so convincingly, your brain begins to fill in the emotional gaps. You start to feel like you must be close, because who else would share something so raw, so private? This is the silent trick. Once someone behaves as if there is already deep intimacy between you, your mind begins to reverse engineer that closeness. You reason, if they trust me, then surely I can trust them. And before you know it, you've responded with something vulnerable of your own. something you weren't planning to say, something you can't take back. This is not an accident. It's not coincidence. It's design. Presumed intimacy works because it shortcuts the slow, natural process of building trust. Normally, intimacy takes time, shared experiences, repeated signals of safety. But this tactic hijacks that timeline by pretending you've already gone through it. It acts as if the emotional contract is signed before you've even read the terms. Let's say someone says to you, "I don't usually tell people this, but I feel like I can be real with you." That one sentence does three things at once. First, it flatters you. You feel chosen. Second, it sets the tone. This is no longer surface level. Third, it pressures you. Because if they just opened up, shouldn't you respond in kind? Now you're in a loop. The more you share, the more bonded you feel. And the more bonded you feel, the more you trust. Not because it's safe, but because it feels like it should be. That's the trap. This bias is powerful because it doesn't need facts. It only needs emotion. It's used by con artists, by recruiters, by bad lovers, by manipulative bosses. The trick isn't just to get close, it's to assume you already are, and let you do the rest. Imagine this in a professional setting. A client walks in, and your new manager greets them with, "You're gonna love working with us. This team already feels like family." That statement plants a seed, not just of comfort, but of obligation. Family? Already? Well, now you'd better behave accordingly. Loyalty, patience, openness, those aren't earned. They're assumed. And if you resist, you look cold. You look ungrateful. You look untrustworthy. That's the sinister brilliance of presumed intimacy. It frames boundaries as awkward. It paints resistance as rejection. If you hold back, you feel like you're the one breaking something sacred, even if it was never real to begin with. Now, imagine it in a romantic context. First date, barely an hour in, and they say, "I feel like I've known you for years," or "I've never connected with anyone this fast." Sounds flattering, right? But underneath that compliment is a setup. If you don't feel the same, now you're questioning your own emotional instincts. Am I cold? Am I missing something? Or worse, do I not deserve this connection? You see how it works? It uses warmth like a weapon, trust like a leash. The danger here isn't just in the oversharing, it's in the imbalance. You feel like you're matching their vulnerability, but what you don't see is that their story may have been rehearsed, polished, used on others. Meanwhile, your story, yours was real, raw, fresh. They made you feel like you were catching up to their emotional depth, but in reality, they were waiting for you to hand over the most private parts of yourself, just because they acted like you already belonged to them. This tactic is so effective because our brains confuse familiarity with safety. When someone skips steps, uses nicknames too soon, shares secrets, references you like you're already close, it causes an emotional fog. We lower our guard because we don't want to disrupt what feels good. Because most people don't want to be the one who says, "Hold on, we don't actually know each other." That sounds cold, rude, paranoid. So instead, we lean in. We match their tone. We follow the emotional rhythm, even when something inside us whispers that it's moving too fast. And once you've shared something personal, once you've mirrored their openness, you've given them something irreversible. They now know where your walls are, what makes you hesitate, what haunts you, and they got all of it, without earning it. So the next time someone looks at you too warmly, too soon, and says, "You're easy to talk to," pause. The next time someone treats you like an old friend within minutes, watch what you feel pulled to say. Notice that pressure, that pull, that ache to match their intensity. Because that pull isn't connection, it's programming. And if you don't see it coming, you'll wake up days or weeks later wondering how someone got so deep inside your world without ever knocking. That's the presumed intimacy bias, not a closeness you chose, a closeness you were tricked into protecting. Emotional repetition, bond. There's a reason you keep going back. To the song, the story, the person, the place. You know how it ends, you've heard it before, but something inside you keeps reaching, again and again, not for the facts, but for the feeling. That is the power of the emotional repetition bond. It doesn't rely on logic. It doesn't persuade with argument. It bypasses reason and slips into the bloodstream by repeating emotion, not information. Fear, joy, longing, nostalgia, looped, layered, reinforced, until time begins to blur. This tactic is used by storytellers, cult leaders, marketers, lovers, and manipulators alike. Because when you feel something repeatedly, especially in rhythmic cycles, it becomes harder to separate the trigger from the truth. Here's how it works. The first time you feel a powerful emotion in someone's presence, it imprints. Your mind marks the moment. But if that emotion is triggered again and again and again, in varying forms in different settings, something deeper happens. You stop analyzing, and you start associating. The person becomes the emotion. The group becomes the joy. The ritual becomes the safety. The object becomes the comfort. And slowly, your internal clock shuts off. Because emotional repetition doesn't just bond you, it dissolves your sense of normal time. In cult environments, this is ritualized. Music swells, voices rise, you cry, you laugh, you feel seen. Then the moment fades and starts again. New words, same rhythm, new faces, same feelings. After a while, you can't remember how long you've been there. Hours, days, weeks. Because when emotions repeat, linear time breaks. This is how people lose themselves inside movements, ideologies, relationships they once thought they could control. Not because they were told lies, but because they were shown the same feelings over and over until those feelings became reality. It happens in romantic manipulation too. They make you laugh, like no one else. They hold you when you cry. You fight, but they always come back with the same line, the same apology, the same moment of sweetness that melts everything. Over time, the cycle feels like fate, because it's not the words that matter. It's the pattern. It's the emotional music playing on loop, telling your nervous system, this is where I belong. Even advertising uses it. Commercials show you families at dinner, laughter around a fire, childhood memories, the scent of old books, a dog's tail wagging. Every image tied to an emotion you already remember. Then, quietly, they insert the product. You don't think, do I need this? You feel, that feels like home. And that's the secret. Emotional repetition creates emotional ownership. You don't just experience the moment. You begin to depend on it. In psychological terms, this taps into affective conditioning. The repeated pairing of a stimulus with an emotional state builds a reinforced bond until the stimulus alone evokes the feeling. You don't need the full memory anymore. A sound, a phrase, a look. That's enough. The feeling returns on command, and with it, the loyalty. That's why high-control groups repeat songs, why abusers use the same scripts, why influencers recycle nostalgia. Because if they can make you feel the same thing over and over, they can make you stay. Not because it's right, because it's familiar. This is how people end up defending what once hurt them, craving what once scared them, missing what once broke them. Because the bond wasn't built on facts, it was built on rhythm. So, how do you break free? First, interrupt the pattern. Emotions are powerful, but they need fuel. Step outside the cycle, change the environment, the soundtrack, the stimulus. Second, bring back time, journal, mark days, count. Reconnect to a sense of duration. Emotional loops distort time, so reclaiming time can dissolve the illusion. And third, trust your boredom. If something once made you feel alive, but now just feels hollow, listen to that silence. It might be the sound of your nervous system waking up. Emotional repetition bonds are beautiful when mutual, honest, and free. But when they're engineered, when someone keeps giving you the same emotional high to keep you hooked, they're not loving you. They're programming you. So the next time you hear the same words, feel the same rush, enter the same loop, pause. Ask yourself, is this connection? Or is this just a feeling that forgot how to end? Self-comparison sabotage. Imagine someone handing you a compliment, a genuine one it seems, thoughtful, measured. They compare you favorably to someone else, someone a little clumsy, a little unrefined, maybe less thoughtful. And you nod, grateful. It feels good to be seen, to be appreciated. But as the conversation continues, there's something else beneath it. A subtle shift. The praise now hangs like an expectation, unspoken but real, as if that image they painted must now be preserved, or risk disappointment. This is self-comparison sabotage. It begins with a compliment. Not a grand one, not loud, just quiet recognition. But the compliment is built on contrast. You were good, better than someone else, and that contrast becomes a frame. Once placed around you, it's hard to step outside it without feeling as though you've failed. This tactic is ancient and effective. In early Roman education, tutors were taught to compare students aloud. One boy's handwriting was neater than another's. One girl's recitation smoother than her classmates. The praise was always gentle, but always directed in contrast. It fostered ambition, but it also quietly tethered self-worth to being the better one. If a mistake followed, it felt heavier. Not just an error, but a slip in status. In medieval households, this dynamic often appeared between siblings. A mother might say, "You've always been the responsible one, not like your brother, always losing things." The sentence seems innocent, but now the child's identity is caught. To drop a dish, to misplace a key, these become not small accidents, but cracks in a role they were praised for. The compliment becomes a cage, and the sabotage is slow. In 17th century letters between courtiers and their patrons, you can find examples of this pattern. A writer might open with admiration, "You, unlike others, have always understood the value of discretion." The phrase is flattering, but it also lays a trap. Any future slip, any gossip, any revealed secret no longer harms the moment. It harms the identity the compliment created. The fear of slipping from that comparison becomes a silent pressure. This tactic persists in politics, mentorship, even friendship. A leader might say to an advisor, "I've always counted on your clarity, far more than the others who let emotions cloud their view." In that moment, the advisor is elevated, but not freely. Now, to show emotion is to fall. To differ is to disappoint. The praise was conditional, and its condition is silence. Even in intimate relationships, this pattern appears. A partner might say, "You're not like the others I've dated. You're so much more grounded." At first, it feels warm, affirming. But in time, the comparison becomes a shadow. If you falter, react, hesitate, then what? Are you still the grounded one? Or have you failed not only the moment, but the image they painted? This is the heart of the sabotage, the way it hides inside warmth. The compliment feels sincere, but it is shaped like a ladder. The moment you stop climbing, you fall. Psychologically, this taps into what's known as social comparison theory. Humans assess themselves not in isolation, but in relation to others. When someone offers praise by contrast, they're providing a shortcut. You don't just feel good, you feel better than someone else. But now, staying better becomes a task. In quiet courtrooms, in monastery debates, in university halls, this pattern left traces. In the 12th century, a teacher at the University of Paris wrote in his margins, "I must continue as I have been seen or be seen no more." He was referring not to knowledge, but to perception. Once framed as the clever one, the insightful one, he no longer felt free to speculate aloud. The role others praised him for now ruled what he could show. Even in rural villages, where social life turned on simple reputations, the same pattern emerged. A baker praised as always generous, unlike that other one, might begin to overgive. Not from generosity, but from fear. Fear that if he did not continue, the comparison would reverse. Because comparisons are never fixed. They tilt. They flip. And once you are framed in contrast, the only way to keep your worth is to keep the comparison alive. This is why the sabotage is so quiet. It asks nothing aloud. It only implies. You are praised, not directly, but in contrast. And now, to preserve your place, you must not change. Permission, paralysis. It'll trigger. They hesitate, maybe just for a second. You see it in their eyes, a flicker of uncertainty, a pause before the answer. They're weighing something, doubting, maybe unsure of what to do. And then you ask a simple question. Do you need permission to decide? They blink, straighten. No, they say instantly. Of course not. But in that moment, something important just happened. You didn't give them confidence. You gave them a trigger, one that made them override doubt not by clarity, but by pride. This is the permission paralysis trigger. It's not about helping someone make a decision. It's about making them feel like they made one, when in reality, the framework was already planted by you. It creates the illusion of independent thought, while subtly shaping the outcome in your favor. You never told them what to choose. You just implied that needing permission would make them look weak. So, they rushed to prove they didn't. And just like that, they made the decision you wanted, without ever realizing they were nudged. Let's break this down. People hate to feel controlled. Even compliant individuals want to believe their choices are their own. So, when faced with uncertainty and then challenged, especially publicly, on their autonomy, they instinctively assert it. Not because they've reached clarity, but because they don't want to admit hesitation. This taps into a deep psychological reflex. Reactance. It's the internal pushback we feel when we sense our freedom is being threatened. The irony is, the moment you ask someone if they need permission, you provoke this reflex. They'll often choose the opposite of what they believe you're implying, just to protect the idea that they are free. But here's the trap. You chose when to ask the question. You chose the moment to frame the decision as a matter of independence, and in doing so, you made them feel like the only way to protect their pride was to take the action you were silently pointing them toward. It's a performance of autonomy, one they didn't write, but one they'll defend as their own. Let's look at an example. Imagine a team meeting. A junior colleague has a strong idea, but seems hesitant to speak. You lean in and say, "Do you need someone's permission to speak your mind here?" Immediately, the energy shifts. They shake their head, sit up, and launch into their pitch. They think they've just claimed their voice, but they only did it because you framed hesitation as dependence. You didn't encourage boldness. You made them afraid of looking passive. That's the essence of the trigger. It doesn't invite bravery. It shames compliance just enough to provoke rebellion, but only in the direction you're steering. It shows up in relationships, too. A partner wants to go out with friends, but seems unsure. You smile and say, "Are you waiting for me to say it's okay?" Suddenly they insist no. They were going anyway. And they go. Not because they were sure, but because they now feel like backing down would make them look submissive. They defend freedom by falling into a decision trap. And it's not just individuals. This works on groups, in politics, in marketing, in cults of personality. A speaker might say, "You don't need the media's permission to think for yourself, do you?" And suddenly, agreement becomes a badge of defiance. People begin parroting the message, not because they believe it, but because they want to prove they aren't controlled. This is where it becomes dangerous, because now, autonomy becomes performative. You're no longer evaluating the choice based on truth or reason. You're reacting to a subtle insult, a suggestion that maybe you're not your own person. And so, to prove that you are, you make a decision without reflection. You say yes when you should have paused. You speak when you should have waited. You agree when your body wasn't ready. All because someone asked a question that pressed the button marked independence. And you couldn't walk away from it without feeling weak. It's a masterstroke of manipulation, because it doesn't look like control. It looks like empowerment. But it isn't. It's pressure dressed as encouragement. So, how do you defend against it? The answer isn't to reject every challenge to your autonomy. It's to recognize the moment your pride gets weaponized. When someone frames a choice as a test of selfhood, pause. Ask, would I still be making this choice if they hadn't asked that question? Am I deciding or am I reacting? The strongest decisions come from clarity, not defiance. You don't need to prove you're free. You only need to be honest about what you want, not what will protect your image. Remember, if someone sets the frame, they're already shaping your move. So next time someone asks, "Do you need permission to act?" Stop. Breathe. Ask yourself who really benefits from your answer. Because confidence isn't the speed of your reaction. It's the stillness that lets you choose without needing to prove anything to any. Mirror discomfort. Glitch. We are pattern-seeking creatures. And nowhere is that more obvious than in conversation. We don't just listen to words. We listen to rhythm, to gesture, to tone, a nod, a smile, a shift in posture. These things communicate more than language ever could. And over time, we've been trained to trust one thing above all else: synchrony, the sense that someone is in tune with us. But what happens when that synchrony glitches? What if someone matches your gestures, but just slightly off? A beat too late, a fraction too delayed. You wave your hand, and then they do. You touch your face, and then they do. You lean in, and then they follow. You wouldn't consciously notice it at first, but your body would. And it would whisper to your nervous system, something's wrong. This is the mirror discomfort glitch. A subtle, unnerving psychological strategy that disarms someone by mimicking their behavior, but with deliberate imperfection. Not enough to alarm them, just enough to confuse their social radar. And in that moment of discomfort, something else happens. They lower their guard. Not because they trust you, but because their brain needs to reassert comfort. And the fastest way to fix social awkwardness is to become nicer. That's the secret. When you subtly disturb someone's unconscious flow without violating it, they instinctively begin smoothing the edges of the interaction. They talk more, laugh nervously, reveal more, agree more, all to reduce the tension they can't quite name. And that's when you learn the most. This tactic doesn't require aggression, dominance, or intimidation. It's not about power, it's about pattern interference. The social brain expects certain rhythms. When you mirror someone exactly, you build trust. That's been proven. But when you mirror them almost, slightly delayed, slightly askew, you don't build trust. You build need. A need to fix the wrongness they can't consciously detect. Let's say you're in a negotiation. The other person gestures broadly while making a point. You mirror it, but just after they stop. You lean forward when they lean back. You nod, but a little too late. Their subconscious feels the mismatch, and their brain reacts. We're out of sync. I need to bring us back. So they soften. They smile more. They repeat themselves. They try to reconnect. And in that effort, they reveal strategy, reveal insecurity, reveal how much they want you to feel okay. They just told you what matters most to them, and all you had to do was glitch the mirror. This works even better in emotionally charged settings. Think of a heated conversation, a confrontation. Someone's body tightens, voice rises, and you copy their stance. But after a beat, their brain is already on alert. But now, it's confused. Are you mocking, matching, threatening? The moment of confusion creates hesitation, and in that gap, you gain control. They stop to reassess. And by the time they regain their rhythm, you've set the tone. This tactic works on the limbic level, the part of the brain that processes safety, mimicry, and group belonging. We are biologically wired to sync with those around us. That's why conversations feel good when gestures align. It's not just manners, it's chemistry. Neurochemicals like oxytocin rise when mirroring occurs smoothly. But when that rhythm slips, when the mirror cracks, the discomfort forces a reset. And most people, in that moment, don't escalate. They appease. It's a vulnerability hidden inside our social software. The need to restore harmony overrides the need to defend ourselves. We interpret the glitch as something we caused. So, we fix it by being more open, more agreeable, less guarded. And that's where this tactic becomes powerful. Not just as manipulation, but as a diagnostic tool. If someone instantly rushes to fix a mirror glitch, they're high in social sensitivity, high in guilt, high in need for approval. And that's information you can use. This technique isn't about mimicking dramatically. It's not mimicry theater. It's surgical, delayed by a breath, offbeat by a second, timed precisely to fall outside the comfort zone, but not outside the social frame. Enough to be felt, not flagged. Some manipulators use it to disarm. Others use it to build false intimacy. A cult recruiter might mirror slightly wrong until the subject overcorrects, pouring out stories, emotions, tears, just to feel understood. A con artist might play awkward, mirroring just off, until you, in your discomfort, start helping them relax. And just like that, you're in their frame. But this tactic doesn't just work on others. It can be used on you. Ever talk to someone who made you feel weirdly off balance? Who nodded just a moment late? Who smiled right after you did? Who adjusted their posture just after you moved? That wasn't bad timing. That was a glitch. A mirror glitch. And if you left that conversation feeling more tired, more exposed, more eager to explain yourself, you've already felt its effect. So, next time someone feels almost in sync, but not quite, don't fill the silence. Don't rush to fix the energy. Don't explain yourself just to ease the moment. Instead, stop. Watch who's really leading the rhythm, because when the mirror breaks, someone is always counting on you to put it back together. Curated vulnerability leak. You're in a conversation. It's early, but not surface level. They've just met you, or maybe you've been speaking for a few hours, and suddenly you drop a story. Not dramatic, not boastful, but real enough to sting. You say something like, "There was a time I failed so badly. I didn't get out of bed for 2 days. Or maybe, I used to be the kind of person who sabotaged everything I loved. I ruined some of the best things in my life because I was afraid I didn't deserve them. You pause. They look at you with quiet surprise. And then, something shifts. They lean in. Their voice softens. They begin to trust you. Because in their mind, only honest people admit their flaws. Only someone genuine would reveal something so private, so painful. But what they don't realize is that what you just shared wasn't random. It was chosen, designed, sharpened over time. You didn't stumble into vulnerability. You deployed it. This is the curated vulnerability leak, a strategy so emotionally persuasive, it makes people feel close to you, even as you're carefully curating what closeness means. See, we live in an age where rawness is currency. People crave authenticity, but true vulnerability is chaotic. It's messy, unfiltered, and it comes with risk. The curated kind, that's different. It's a story crafted to appear spontaneous, even though it's been tested, refined. You've told it before, maybe to different people, maybe with different timing, but always with the same intent, to fast-track trust, to lower their defenses, to make them feel like they have been allowed into a sacred room inside your life. It works because we're trained to see emotional honesty as rare, as earned. So, when someone offers it early, we assume we've been granted access, that we're special. But curated vulnerability is not about sharing to connect. It's about sharing to control. It's not your realest wound. It's your most effective one. It's not your messiest moment. It's your most useful. And the brilliance of this technique is that it makes people believe they're peeling back your layers, when in reality, they're being shown exactly what you've prepared. Let's say someone tells a story like this. Back when I was starting out, I made a mistake that nearly cost me my job. I ignored advice, thought I knew better, ended up crashing the whole system. But that failure taught me everything. It humbled me. It changed the way I lead. Sounds honest, right? But it's not just a confession. It's a narrative that ends in redemption, control, maturity. You're not hearing their pain. You're hearing their authority. The story is designed to invite trust, admiration, and sympathy, while maintaining full control of how you perceive them. They appear vulnerable, but they're untouchable. This tactic is everywhere, in leadership, dating, sales, social media. Influencers cry on camera about burnout, right before launching a new project. Politicians confess past mistakes, right before asking for your vote. Speakers tell emotional stories of childhood trauma, framed perfectly to land on a TEDx stage. These aren't random bursts of emotion. These are calculated releases, curated cracks in the armor. The key isn't what they share, it's when, how, and why. The moment you feel emotionally disarmed, that's when the tactic has landed. And here's the uncomfortable truth. It doesn't have to be malicious. People use this without malice. They just learn, over time, which parts of their story make people like them, which scars earn respect, which stumbles make them human, but not threatening. It's like a magician showing you the trick they want you to notice, so you don't question what's really happening in the other hand. Let's make this real. You meet someone new. On the second conversation, they say, I used to have horrible social anxiety. I'd freeze at parties, avoid calls. I even lost friends over it. But I worked hard to grow from that. Now, that's not just a vulnerability, that's a badge. It signals self-awareness. It creates relatability. But what you don't see is that this story also tells you exactly what to believe. That they're now confident. That they've grown. That they used to be broken. But now they're healed. You weren't invited to explore their wounds. You were guided to admire their recovery. That's the leak. It looks like openness, but it's really direction, framing, control, and the most dangerous part, it works. Even when you know what it is, it works. Because humans are wired to respond to emotional disclosures. They feel intimate, earned, rare. And the person who shows you those cracks, curated or not, will always feel more trustworthy than the person who doesn't. So now ask yourself, when was the last time you did this? When was the last time you shared a story of failure? Not because you were breaking down, but because you knew it would soften the room, make the audience lean in, make the stranger believe you were safer, deeper, more real. When was the last time your story wasn't raw, but strategic? Because we all do it. Some people use curated vulnerability to protect themselves, releasing controlled pain so no one goes deeper. Others use it to gain power, building emotional intimacy they haven't earned. Some use it to inspire, some to disarm, some to sell. But the effect is always the same. You feel seen. And in that feeling, you let your guard down, even if they never drop theirs. So, next time someone tells you, "I've never told anyone this before," pause. Look for the polish, the pacing, the way the story lands too perfectly between the laughter and the silence. Ask yourself, is this real pain, or is it just real useful? Because curated vulnerability doesn't lie. It just tells the truth in the most strategic way possible. Fading warmth effect. It starts with light, with warmth, with someone looking at you like you matter more than anyone else in the room. Their voice is soft. Their laughter comes easy. They remember details. They notice when your mood shifts, and you start to feel safe, maybe even special. But then, slowly something changes. They don't pull away violently. They don't criticize. They don't disappear. They just cool. The smiles become rarer. The tone turns flat. Responses come slower. Compliments fade. Their gaze doesn't linger the way it used to. You wonder what you did wrong, and you try to fix it. This is the fading warmth effect, one of the most quietly effective emotional manipulations you'll ever encounter, because it doesn't break you. It makes you do the breaking. It begins with intense warmth, not love bombing exactly, but a focused glow. You're given attention, approval, affection, enough to feel seen, enough to bond. Then, just as you settle into the comfort of it, they begin to step back, subtly, casually, and that's when the hunger sets in. The human brain isn't built for loss without reason. When something positive is taken away, we instinctively look for cause, and if we can't find it externally, we turn inward. You start replaying conversations, analyzing texts, second-guessing your tone, wondering if you were too cold, too distant, too demanding. But the truth is, you were targeted because you responded to warmth, and now you're being conditioned. In behavioral psychology, this is known as intermittent reinforcement, one of the most addictive feedback loops possible. When approval is constant, we grow accustomed to it. When it's withdrawn entirely, we move on. But when it's given and taken at random, we chase it, desperately. The fading warmth effect weaponizes this. It gives you a taste of belonging, then rations it. And each moment of withheld affection feels like a puzzle only you are meant to solve. You try harder, you get quieter, you mold yourself, adjust yourself, shrink yourself, just to get that spark of warmth back. But it doesn't come the way it used to, and that's the point. This tactic is often used in toxic relationships, high-control mentorships, manipulative friendships, and even cults. It's not loud, it's not explosive, it's subtle erosion. And it works because the victim internalizes the blame. You believe you lost the warmth because you changed. But really the other person did. They just did it slowly enough that you didn't notice the shift until you were the one working to restore it. And that's where control is gained. Not through dominance, through withdrawal. Think about a coach who praises you intensely at first, your progress, your form, your potential. Then, as time passes, becomes colder. Not cruel, just distant. You don't slack off. You train harder. Because now, success isn't the goal. Re-earning their warmth is. Or a boss who once called you brilliant, visionary, essential, now barely looks up from their desk. You start staying late, volunteering, giving more than you're asked, not for promotion, for return. The warmth you once had becomes the carrot, and now you're chasing it. In romantic relationships, it's devastating. They start by making you feel chosen, unique, safe. Then the slow fade begins. Less touch, less curiosity, less joy. You cry, and they say you're too sensitive. You question, and they call you insecure. But once, they return to that warmth. Just for a moment. And it hooks you all over again. You think, there it is. They're back. But they're not. That flash of affection wasn't a return. It was reinforcement. To keep you locked in the cycle. And each time it happens, your tolerance for cold increases. Your standards shift. You no longer ask to be loved. You ask to be noticed. So, how do you break this? First, track the timeline. If someone's energy toward you changed significantly after they won your trust, pause. Don't adjust yourself. Observe them. Second, test their warmth. Does it return when you pull away? Is their affection conditional on your compliance? And third, restore your baseline. Go back to what you needed before their warmth rewrote your self-worth. Because here's the truth most never hear. If someone's kindness disappears when you stop performing, it was never kindness. It was bait. The fading warmth effect isn't about affection, it's about control. So the next time someone makes you work to earn back what they took away, ask yourself, is this love? Or am I just chasing a temperature that was never meant to last? Anchored reality filter. Imagine sitting at a table you've known since childhood. The cups are placed just so. The bread is cut into the same familiar shapes. The window lets in the light a certain way each morning. And someone, maybe a parent, a mentor, a partner, leans in and says, "This is just how things are, always have been." You nod. Not because you've examined the idea, but because the routine feels safe, predictable, anchored. This is the anchored reality filter. It works not by persuasion, but by framing, by gently defining what is ordinary, expected, acceptable, so that anything outside that frame feels not just strange, but wrong. The power lies in the anchor. Once a baseline is set, of what's normal, good, respectable, correct, everything else is measured against it. And when the anchor is repeated often enough, it becomes invisible. Not a rule, but a background assumption, a filter through which all other ideas must pass. This isn't a modern tactic. It's as old as the first communities that needed cohesion. In early Mesopotamian city-states, temple authorities would define not just religious doctrine, but the rhythm of daily life. What time to rise, how to wash, what to eat, what to expect from your neighbors. The gods had decreed, but it was the priests who repeated the rhythm, day after day, until deviation felt like chaos. In medieval Europe, anchoring reality often came from the pulpit. The local priest described the world not in debate, but in statements. The earth was flat. Suffering was a test. The afterlife was certain. People rarely heard alternative views. And so, the reality offered became the only reality imagined. Not through argument, through repetition. In the 19th century, factory life introduced a different kind of anchoring. Lunch breaks were set. Behavior was codified. To question the system was not simply rebellion, it was instability. Workers adapted their sense of normal around the clock. The factory shaped time itself. That's what the anchored reality filter does. It doesn't change facts, it changes context. It says, this is the way things are. And once people accept that, any challenge feels like a threat. Not because of logic, but because it shakes the frame that gave life its rhythm. Imagine a student told that a certain subject is hard, that most people struggle, that success is rare. They carry that belief with them. Even when they begin to succeed, it feels temporary, fragile, because the reality anchor says they shouldn't. Their achievement becomes the deviation, not the norm. This filter can be found in small phrases. That's just how people are. This is how it's always been done. No one else thinks that way. Each phrase defines a baseline, not of truth, but of perceived truth. And once defined, it becomes a kind of silent pressure. To step outside, it feels risky. Not just socially, but mentally, because the anchor offers stability, even when wrong. In 20th century advertising, this filter was weaponized. Companies didn't just sell products, they sold norms. Most mothers choose this soap. Real men drink this brand. Everyone uses this toothpaste. The product mattered less than the frame. The consumer was nudged to ask, not, do I want this? But, am I the kind of person who fits this normal? Deviation became discomfort. Not by rule, but by suggestion. Even in relationships, this tactic appears. A partner might say, couples who love each other don't need space. A mentor might say, real professionals never miss a deadline. A parent might whisper, good children don't speak that way. None of these statements allow space. They define a reality. They set the anchor. And anything outside that becomes deviant, even if it's healthy, true, or necessary. That's the sabotage. Because once the filter is in place, people will question themselves before questioning the frame. A woman in the 1950s who disliked housework might assume there's something wrong with her, not with the role. A child told they are too emotional may begin to distrust their feelings entirely. A worker called, not a team player, may begin to doubt their value, even if they were only speaking up. The anchored reality filter doesn't need evidence. It needs confidence, a quiet, steady insistence that this is just how things are. And eventually, the mind conforms. But reality is not always fixed. Throughout history, the strongest shifts came when someone dared to challenge the anchor, when Galileo pointed a telescope and said, "Look again." When an enslaved person learned to read and realized, this isn't natural, it's imposed. When a child said, "What if I don't want to be the good one today?" And in each case, there was discomfort. Because stepping outside the filter means floating, briefly, in uncertainty. But it also means seeing clearly. So imagine once more, the table, the light, the familiar voice saying, "This is how it's always been." You pause, not to argue, but to ask gently, "Has it?" That moment, the pause before agreement, is where the anchor begins to loosen, and with it, the filter fades. Deliberate misinterpret tactic. They said no, clear, simple, firm, and yet somehow, the conversation didn't end. You tilted your head, furrowed your brow, repeated their words back, slightly wrong. "So, you're saying you're not sure," or "You mean not right now, right?" They corrected you. "No, I mean no." You paused again. Gave a puzzled look. "Sorry, I just want to understand. Is it that you're not comfortable or just not ready?" And now they're explaining themselves, again. Slower, softer, and with every repetition, something fades, their certainty. This is the deliberate misinterpret tactic, a subtle, maddening form of psychological erosion where the manipulator pretends not to grasp a clear refusal, not to argue, not to fight, but to slowly dissolve the clarity of a boundary through feigned confusion. It's not a debate, it's an exhaustion loop, and it's one of the most quietly effective coercive tactics ever used. Here's why it works. Human communication is relational. When we speak, we don't just want to be heard, we want to be understood. When someone acts confused by something we thought was clear, our instinct is to help, to rephrase, to explain, to soften our tone in case we were too harsh. That instinct becomes the tool, because the more we rephrase, the more uncertainty creeps in. Not because we've changed our minds, but because we start managing their perception of our message. Maybe I sounded too firm. Maybe they think I'm being difficult. Maybe they don't get what I'm trying to say. And suddenly, our focus shifts from holding the boundary to explaining the boundary. And that shift is where the power slips away. It happens everywhere. In dating, someone says, "No, I don't want to go out." And the other replies, "Ah, you're just playing hard to get." In sales, a customer says, "I'm not interested." The rep replies, "So you're saying you're just not ready to commit yet?" In toxic friendships, you say, "I don't want to talk about that." They answer, "Oh, so it does bother you." Each time your words are distorted, just enough to pull you into explanation. And the more you explain, the more you feel like maybe your refusal was flawed, that maybe it was too vague, too emotional, too open to misreading. But it wasn't. It was clear the first time. They just chose to misinterpret it, on purpose. The genius of this tactic is that it creates a false innocence. The manipulator never pushes. They never demand. They just ask again, and again, and again, until you're too mentally tired to restate what you already said. And when you finally sigh and say, "Fine," they smile. Not because you agreed, but because they wore you down. And now, they'll use that agreement as proof. They'll say, "You said yes," even though they know that's not how it started. This tactic is especially dangerous in power imbalances. In workplaces, subordinates may say no to an unreasonable request, only to be asked questions like, "Is that because you're overwhelmed or just not prioritizing it?" Now the employee is on the defensive, not defending their time, but their attitude. In abusive relationships, someone might say, "I need space." The response, "So you're saying I'm smothering you now?" The victim flinches, not because they were wrong, but because they feel misunderstood. And now they're comforting the person they tried to set a boundary with. That's the loop. They refuse. You pretend not to understand. They explain. You twist. They clarify. You reframe. And before long, they're apologizing for trying to protect themselves, because they've been baited into defending what should have been honored. The deliberate misinterpret tactic is not always loud. It doesn't scream or shove. It leans in, smiles, tilts its head and says, I'm just trying to get where you're coming from. And in doing so, it wears down the will to resist. It forces people to repeat themselves until they feel ridiculous, until they doubt their tone, until they wonder if maybe they were the ones being unclear. So, how do you break free? First, recognize the signs. If someone consistently misunderstands your boundaries only when you say no, not when you say yes, they're not confused. They're controlling. Second, stop clarifying. A clear no doesn't require a TED Talk. You are not a customer support line for your own limits. You said it. They heard it. The rest is stalling. And third, flip the script. Instead of defending your words, reflect theirs. Why are you pretending not to understand what I clearly said? Watch how fast the innocence melts, because when you break the loop, their confusion can no longer be the excuse. The most powerful thing you can do is trust your first boundary. Don't let their questions steal your certainty. Don't let their rephrasing shrink your clarity. And never explain yourself into surrender, because the moment you do, they'll call it consent. And it wasn't. Predictive behavior frame. It feels like intuition, like magic, like someone seeing straight through your defenses, not to your past, not to your words, but to your next move. You're probably going to smile now, aren't you? And you do. Not because they told you to, but because they knew you would. And suddenly, you trust them more than you should. This is the predictive behavior frame, a psychological strategy that creates the illusion of deep connection by framing your next action before it happens. And when it does, when your behavior matches their prediction, your brain assigns them a power they may not actually have. It's not just a prediction, it's a script you didn't know you were following. And once you follow it once, you'll follow it again. Because the predictive behavior frame works on something ancient in the mind, our need to be understood, not liked, not admired, understood. And when someone accurately describes what we're about to do, our body leans in. Our subconscious whispers, they see you, they get you, they've mapped your code. And in that moment, logic takes a back seat. We trust those who predict us, even if they're the ones writing the script. Imagine you're in a conversation, slightly tense, and the other person says calmly, "You're about to tell me it's not a big deal, right?" Because that's what you always do when things feel uncomfortable. You pause. That was what you were about to say. Now you feel exposed, but not attacked. They knew. And if they knew that, what else do they know? The mind responds by lowering defenses, not out of submission, out of awe. Prediction creates the illusion of insight, but here's the truth most people miss. The person making the prediction wasn't reading your soul. They were shaping your behavior to match their frame. And once you step into that frame, they can tighten it, layer it. Say things like, "You'll probably agree with me in a second." And when you do, your agreement feels less like a choice and more like a prophecy fulfilled. That's the brilliance of this tactic. It isn't reactive, it's inceptive. They don't wait to observe your behavior. They build it, softly, casually, as if they just know you too well, even when they don't. And the more you play along, the deeper the bond feels, because your subconscious begins rewriting the narrative. They understand me. They get me better than I get myself. You ignore red flags. You forgive faster. You reveal more. Because in a world where most people guess, this one person seems to know, and that knowledge feels holy. This is why con artists use predictive framing. They'll say, "You're the type of person who values loyalty, aren't you? I bet you're already thinking of ways to help." And you are. Because they primed you. They created a path, and your brain walked it. Not because it was true, but because it was offered. The mind is suggestible when it's seen. And that's the hidden engine behind predictive behavior framing. It gives you the feeling of being known while quietly scripting your reactions. You lean forward because they said you would. You laugh nervously because they said you always do. You open up because they said, "I bet you've never told anyone this before." And suddenly, you haven't. Until now. The key is not accuracy, it's plausibility. The frame doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to be close enough for your nervous system to recognize. Once that recognition fires, the effect snowballs. Here's where it gets even darker. The more you surrender to the prediction, the more they can push it. First they say, "You're probably going to hesitate." Then they say, "But you'll go along with it anyway." Then, "You always do." And the moment you do, your autonomy slips. They just rewrote your identity as someone predictable, and predictable people are easier to control. This tactic is devastating in close relationships. A partner says, "You're about to apologize even though you're still angry, right?" And you do. Because it's easier than arguing. Because now the apology isn't yours. It's a fulfillment of a frame. And if they can frame that, they can frame everything. So how do you protect yourself? You pause every time someone tells you what you will do next. Because if they're right, ask, did they predict me or push me? Did they observe me or shape me? And if the answer makes you uncomfortable, that's the real frame cracking. The strongest manipulation doesn't scream, it smiles. It gently says, "You're probably going to agree with this part." And you do. And by the time you realize what happened, you've already surrendered more trust than logic would ever allow. Incremental identity shift. It doesn't happen all at once. That would be too obvious, too fast. You don't tell them who they are. You don't even tell them who they should be. You just plant a word, a comment, a reflection. Something they barely notice. Something like, "You've always been the kind of person who thinks deeper than most." Or, "You don't quit easily, I can already tell." And they smile. Maybe shrug. They don't argue. Why would they? It's just a compliment. But in reality, it's the beginning. The first crack in the stone. The first tug on a thread they didn't even know they were holding. Because identity isn't fixed, it's fluid. And the human mind, so desperate to stay consistent, will slowly reshape itself to match the expectations whispered in its ear. This is the incremental identity shift. It's not about manipulation in the traditional sense. It's not control by force. It's control by reflection, by subtly suggesting who someone already is, even if they're not, especially if they are not. And doing it often enough, gently enough, that they start to believe it. You're not pushing, you're guiding. And once they believe they're becoming someone new, they'll start acting like it. Because the most powerful force inside any human being is the drive to prove themselves right about who they think they are. Let's say someone's nervous about a new job. They're unsure, hesitant, and you say, "Honestly, you've always struck me as someone who thrives under pressure." Just that. You didn't tell them to be confident. You didn't correct their fear. You just narrated a version of them that is braver than they feel. And because people don't want to feel inconsistent, they lean into it. They step into that idea like it was always theirs. One sentence. That's all it takes to begin the shift. The trick is never to demand change, never to make it feel like advice. Advice gets resisted. Identity gets worn. You don't say, "You need to be more responsible." You say, "You've always had this reliable energy." Like, you notice things other people miss. You don't say, "Be more confident." You say, "I admire how grounded you always seem, even when things are uncertain." The shift happens slowly, gradually. It builds with each interaction, and eventually, they forget where the idea started. They just feel like they have always been this way. This tactic works because the mind doesn't change through facts, it changes through stories. Especially the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves. And if someone else offers you a better story, one that feels empowering, admired, respected, you're likely to adopt it, just to live in that version of you. You may have already experienced this. Someone once called you the organized one, and ever since, you felt guilty when you're messy. Someone labeled you as the funny friend, and now you feel pressured to be entertaining, even when you're exhausted. Someone once said, "You've always been so mature for your age," and now you carry the weight of that image, even when you want to fall apart. That's the invisible power of identity suggestion. Once someone frames you as a certain type of person, you start editing your behavior to match. You start becoming that person. Not because it's who you were, but because it's who you believe you should be. That's the slow burn of an identity shift. And when done with intention, when guided subtly by someone who knows what they're doing, it's one of the most potent forms of influence alive, because it never feels forced. It feels like truth. Imagine a teacher tells a student, "You're one of the few who really thinks. I see it in how you ask questions." That student, even if they never believed it before, will begin thinking differently, acting smarter, studying harder, not because they were convinced, but because they were seen. Or think of a boss who says, "I know you're someone who cares deeply about details." That's rare. Suddenly the employee who was once careless now checks their work 3 times. Not from fear, from identity. That's what this tactic targets. Not behavior, but self-image. Because if you control someone's concept of who they are, you don't need to control what they do. Their actions will follow naturally. And the most dangerous part? They'll think it was their idea, because you didn't tell them what to believe. You just mirrored it back to them, until it stuck. Even in relationships, this tactic is everywhere. One partner says, "You're so emotionally aware. I love how you always reflect before reacting." And whether or not that's true, it starts becoming true, because now there's pressure, expectation, a role to fulfill. The shift can be used for good, to uplift, to heal, to empower, but it can also be used to manipulate, to shape someone into who you need them to be. Not who they are, not who they want to be, but the version that benefits you most. It can be subtle. "You've always been the one I can count on." Guilt-laced reliability. Or, "You're not the kind of person who would ever hurt me." Weaponized innocence. Each line sounds harmless, sweet even, but each one carries an invisible contract, an expectation. And the moment they accept it, they begin becoming someone new, someone they didn't choose. That's the danger. That we often don't realize how much of who we are was narrated by someone else. So ask yourself, who first called you too much, or the quiet one, or the fixer? Who told you who you were again and again until you internalized it? And who are you now shaping, right now, by the words you choose? The incremental identity shift is not a hammer, it's a whisper. But if you whisper the same thing long enough, people will carry it like truth. Because the deepest changes don't come from pressure. They come from reflection, from repetition, from the slow, invisible shaping of who we think we are. And if you control that, you don't need permission to lead them. They'll walk themselves there, just to prove you right.